The needle trembled in his calloused hands, blood seeping from where he'd pricked his thumb for the third time. Evelyn Moore watched from across the dim station house as the stranger cursed under his breath, struggling with something as simple as mending a torn shirt. Outside, lightning split the Wyoming sky, illuminating his frustration and her choice. She could stay silent, proper, alone. Or she could cross that wooden floor and change everything. Her feet moved before her mind could protest. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The stagecoach had deposited Evelyn Moore into what felt like the edge of the world itself. She stood beneath the sagging overhang of Bridger Station, watching sheets of rain sweep across the prairie like gray curtains drawn by an invisible hand. The wind carried the smell of wet sage and something wilder, something that made her heart clench with equal parts terror and exhilaration. Behind her, the stagecoach driver was already unhitching the horses, muttering about the storm and washed-out roads and how they'd be stuck here until morning at the earliest. Morning. The word felt like a prison sentence. Evelyn clutched her carpet bag tighter, feeling the weight of everything she owned pressing against her ribs. 3 dresses, 2 books, a photograph she should have burned, and a teaching certificate that felt increasingly like a ticket to nowhere. Boston seemed impossibly far away now, not just in miles, but in every measure that mattered. The gas-lit streets, the orderly brownstones, the society pages that had once included her name alongside words like promising and well-connected. That was before Thomas Whitmore had left her standing at the church, before the whispers had started, spreading through drawing rooms like poison through veins, before her father had looked at her across the breakfast table and said, with devastating gentleness, "Perhaps a change of scenery, Evelyn, a fresh start." As if humiliation could be outrun, as if shame didn't follow you like a shadow, even to the Wyoming territory. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it seemed to split the sky in two. Evelyn flinched and hurried toward the station house door, her traveling boots squelching in mud that would have horrified her seamstress back home. The door stuck, swollen with moisture, and she had to throw her shoulder against it before it gave way with a groan that sounded almost human. Inside, the station house was a single large room that smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and unwashed bodies. A pot-bellied stove crouched in the corner, radiating blessed warmth. Rough-hewn benches lined the walls, and a counter separated the main room from what she assumed were the station master's quarters. An oil lamp swung gently from a ceiling beam, casting dancing shadows that made the whole place feel unstable, as if it might blow away with the next gust of wind. 2 other travelers had claimed the space before her. An elderly woman sat nearest the stove, her gnarled fingers working knitting needles with the kind of mindless efficiency that spoke of decades of practice. She didn't look up when Evelyn entered, just kept knitting, the click, click, click of her needles providing a steady counterpoint to the rain hammering against the roof. The other traveler was a man. He sat in the far corner, hat pulled low, shoulders hunched in a way that suggested he wanted nothing to do with company or conversation. Rain had darkened his clothes to near black, and his boots, good boots, Evelyn noticed, well made and well worn, were caked with mud halfway up the calf. A rifle leaned against the wall beside him, casual but present, the way men carried weapons out here. Not for show, but for use. Evelyn had been warned about Western men. Rough, her aunt had said. Uncivilized, dangerous. Looking at him now, water dripping from the brim of his hat, she couldn't quite disagree. She found a spot on a bench roughly equidistant from both strangers, close enough to the stove to benefit from its warmth, far enough from the man to maintain propriety, and set down her bag with a soft thump. Her traveling dress was soaked through, the hem heavy with mud and water. She'd probably ruined it. The thought should have bothered her more than it did. The station master emerged from the back room, a bearish man with a salt and pepper beard and suspicious eyes. He looked Evelyn up and down with the kind of frank assessment that would have earned him a sharp rebuke in any Boston parlor. "Stage ain't going nowhere till this blows over," he announced, as if this weren't already obvious. "Might be morning, might be longer. Got some stew if you want it. 2 bits. Evelyn fumbled in her reticule for coins, her fingers clumsy with cold. The stew, when it came, was mostly broth with a few lonely vegetables floating like shipwreck survivors. But it was hot, and that was something. She ate slowly, letting the warmth spread through her chest, trying not to think about the elegant dinners she'd once taken for granted. Another crack of thunder. The lamp swung more violently, and for a moment the light caught the man in the corner at just the right angle. He was younger than she'd initially thought. Maybe 30, give or take a few years. His face was weathered by sun and wind in a way that made exact age hard to pin down. Strong jaw, dark with several days' worth of stubble. A nose that had been broken at least once. And when the light hit his eyes, just for that instant, they were the startling blue of a winter sky. He was also, she realized with a start, trying to sew. The recognition was so incongruous that for a moment, Evelyn simply stared. The man had removed his coat, a heavy oilskin duster now draped over the bench beside him, revealing a shirt that had seen better days. The fabric was torn along one shoulder seam, a ragged rip that exposed the union suit beneath. He held a needle and thread in hands that seemed far too large for such delicate work, jabbing at the tear with a concentration that was almost painful to watch. The needle missed, jabbed again, missed. His hands were shaking. Not much, just a slight tremor that made the needle waver like a compass seeking north. But enough. Enough that even from across the room, Evelyn could see he was making a mess of it. The stitches were huge and uneven, pulling the fabric in ways that would make the repair worse than the original tear. He cursed under his breath. Nothing she was supposed to hear, but in the close confines of the station house, sound carried. Then he jabbed the needle again, too hard this time, and Evelyn saw a bright bead of blood well up on his thumb. He didn't react, just wiped the blood on his trousers and tried again. Something in Evelyn's chest tightened. She knew she should stay quiet. Proper young ladies from Boston didn't speak to strange men in isolated stations. They especially didn't offer unsolicited help, no matter how badly needed. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, clear as a bell. A lady guards her reputation above all else, Evelyn. Once lost, it cannot be recovered. But then, Evelyn had already lost her reputation, hadn't she? Thomas had seen to that when he'd sent his brother to the church with a note instead of coming himself. When the note had been read by the minister, then by the guests, then by every gossip in Boston society. What did propriety matter now? Before she could talk herself out of it, Evelyn stood. The bench creaked beneath her. The old woman's knitting needles paused for just a beat, then resumed their rhythm. The man didn't look up, too focused on his failing battle with needle and thread. Evelyn's boots sounded too loud on the wooden floor as she crossed the room. 6 steps. 7. The man finally noticed her approach and glanced up, wariness flickering across his features. Up close, she could see the tremor in his hands more clearly, could see the frustration etched around his eyes, the set of his jaw that suggested stubborn pride warring with practical necessity. "You're making quite a mess of that," she said, keeping her voice gentle, the way she might address a struggling student. The man stared at her. In the lamplight, his eyes were even more striking, blue as a jay's wing, sharp with intelligence despite the rough exterior. For a long moment, he didn't speak, and Evelyn wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. If Western men took offense at such directness. If... "My only good shirt," he said finally. His voice was deep, rough-edged, with an accent she couldn't quite place. Not quite Southern, not quite anything. "Caught it on a fence post this morning." He said it like a confession, like the shirt mattered in ways that went beyond simple clothing. Evelyn understood that, perhaps more than he realized. Sometimes the things we owned were all that stood between us and complete dissolution. "Then you should probably let someone who knows what they're doing fix it," she said, surprised by her own boldness, "before you turn it into a rag." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "You offering Miss Moore, Evelyn Moore." She extended her hand, then realized he was still holding the needle. Awkwardly, he set it down, wiped his palm on his trousers, the one without blood on it, and took her hand. His grip was careful, as if he was afraid of crushing her fingers. His palm was rough with calluses, warm despite the shaking. "Caleb Rhodes," he said, "and I'd be grateful, Miss Moore, if you've got the skill. This needle and I aren't getting along." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I can see that." She settled onto the bench beside him, close enough to work, careful to maintain a respectable distance, and reached for the needle. Caleb handed it over with visible relief, though she noticed he watched her hands carefully, as if memorizing her movements. The tear was worse up close. He'd already made several attempts at repair, each one more catastrophic than the last. The fabric was puckered where he'd pulled the thread too tight, and in one spot, he'd somehow managed to sew the shirt to itself, creating a strange pleat that served no purpose. "Dear Lord," Evelyn murmured, "you really did make a mess of it." "Told you," Caleb said, and this time there was definitely amusement in his voice. "Never was much good with needle and thread. Always had my—" He stopped abruptly, something shuddering behind his eyes. "Always had someone else to do it." The pause spoke volumes. Evelyn didn't press, just began carefully unpicking his disastrous stitches. The thread came away easily. He hadn't pulled it tight enough in most places, revealing the original tear. It was clean, at least. A simple rip that would be easy enough to fix with proper technique. "Where did you learn?" Caleb asked after a moment. "Sewing like that?" "Boston," Evelyn said, threading the needle with practiced ease. "Every young lady of a certain class learns needlework, along with piano, French, and how to pretend she finds tedious conversation fascinating." He huffed something that might have been a laugh. "Sounds awful." "It was," Evelyn agreed, surprising herself with the honesty. She began stitching, small even pulls that would hold without puckering. "Though I suppose it has its uses. Even here." "Here," Caleb repeated, making it sound like a question. "Pine Hollow. I'm to be the new school teacher." The word still felt strange in her mouth. School teacher. Her. The woman who'd been raised to marry well, host dinners, manage a household staff. "I start next week." "Pine Hollow," Caleb said slowly. "That's my territory." Evelyn's fingers paused for just a second, then resumed their work. "You live there?" "Near enough. Got a ranch about 5 miles out. Silver Ridge, though calling it a ranch might be generous at this point. More of a hope and a prayer with some cattle attached." Despite herself, Evelyn smiled. "That sounds like most ventures out here, from what I've heard." "Ain't that the truth?" He shifted on the bench, and she caught a whiff of horse, leather, and something cleaner. Soap, maybe, though it was hard to tell under the rain smell. "What brings a Boston lady to a place like Pine Hollow, if you don't mind my asking?" Evelyn did mind, but she also understood the question was fair. People didn't come to the Wyoming territory without a reason, and those reasons were usually tinged with desperation or disaster. "Opportunity," she said carefully, keeping her eyes on her stitching. "The position opened up, and I needed a fresh start, an escape, a place where no one knew about Thomas or the wedding or the pitying looks. A change." Caleb was quiet for a moment, then, "Opportunity. That's a polite way of putting it." Evelyn glanced up, ready to be offended, but his expression held no judgment, just understanding, as if he recognized the careful euphemism for what it was. "And you?" she asked, turning the question back on him. "What brought you to Silver Ridge?" "Same thing," he said simply. "Change. Opportunity. The chance to build something that's mine." "Were you a soldier?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Something about the way he held himself, the casual competence with the rifle, the way he scanned the room when he thought no one was watching. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Was." "The war?" "Yes, ma'am." She waited, but he didn't elaborate. Just watched her hands move through the fabric, the needle catching lamplight as it rose and fell. The station house felt smaller somehow, the storm outside louder. The old woman's knitting needles had stopped, though Evelyn couldn't tell if she was listening or simply resting. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said quietly. "I know it was terrible." "It was," Caleb agreed. "But it's done now. Time to build instead of destroy, right?" There was something fragile in the way he said it, as if he didn't quite believe it himself. As if the building was harder than the destroying had been. Evelyn understood that too. Starting over was supposed to be hopeful, energizing. Instead, it often just felt exhausting. She finished the last stitch and bit the thread clean, a habit from childhood that her mother had tried and failed to break. "There. Good as new. Or at least good as it was before you attacked it." Caleb took the shirt, examining her work with careful attention. His hands had stopped shaking, she noticed. Or maybe they'd been steady for a while now, and she'd just been too focused to notice. "That's fine work, Miss Moore," he said, genuine appreciation in his voice. "Real fine, thank you." "You're welcome, Mr. Rhodes." "Caleb," he corrected. "Out here, we don't stand much on formality." "Evelyn, then," she replied, and felt something shift between them. Something small but significant, like the first crack in ice before a thaw. He pulled the shirt back on, fumbling with the buttons. The fabric sat properly on his shoulders now, no longer pulling awkwardly where his stitches had distorted it. When he looked back at her, there was a question in his eyes. "Can I ask you something, Evelyn?" She nodded, curious despite herself. "Why'd you come over here? You didn't have to help. Most folks would have just let me struggle." Evelyn considered the question. She could give him the polite answer, something about Christian charity or simple kindness. But there was something about this man, this moment, this rain-soaked station house at the edge of nowhere that demanded honesty. "Because I know what it's like," she said finally, "to be alone and struggling with something that should be simple. And I know what it means when someone offers help without being asked." Understanding flickered across his face. He started to speak, but another crash of thunder drowned out whatever he'd been about to say. The lamp swung wildly, the flame guttering for a heart-stopping moment before steadying. Rain hammered against the roof with renewed violence, and somewhere in the distance, something, a tree branch maybe, snapped with a sound like a gunshot. "Hell of a storm," Caleb muttered, moving to the window. He peered out into the darkness, though there was little to see beyond the rain-streaked glass. "Haven't seen one this bad since spring." "Is it always like this?" Evelyn asked, joining him at the window. "The weather, I mean." "Sometimes worse," he said with a slight smile. "Welcome to Wyoming territory, Miss Moore, where the land's beautiful, the opportunities are endless, and the weather will try to kill you just for spite." She laughed before she could help it, a real laugh, the first she'd managed in months. "You paint such an appealing picture." "Just being honest. Wouldn't want you going into teaching with any illusions." "I appreciate that," Evelyn said, and meant it. There had been too many illusions in Boston, too many pretty lies wrapped in elegant words. Honesty, even brutal honesty, felt like a relief. They stood there for a moment, watching the storm rage beyond the glass. Lightning flashed, illuminating the prairie in stark white relief, miles of grass bent nearly horizontal by the wind, the stage road transformed into a river of mud, the mountains in the distance reduced to dark shadows against a darker sky. "You scared?" Caleb asked quietly. "Of the storm?" "Of all of it. The territory, the teaching, starting over." Evelyn took a breath. "Terrified," she admitted. "Absolutely terrified." "Good," he said, surprising her. "Means you've got sense. The ones who aren't scared are the ones who don't last. They come out here thinking it'll be an adventure, thinking the land will roll over for them because they want it to. Then the first winter hits, or the first drought, or the first time they realize the nearest doctor's 3 days away, and they fold, head back east with their tails between their legs." "And you?" Evelyn asked. "Are you scared?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Every damn day," he said finally, "but I'm more scared of failing than I am of the land, and that makes all the difference." Something in his words resonated deep in Evelyn's chest. Yes, she thought, that was exactly it. The fear of failing, of being defeated, of proving all the doubters right. That fear was worse than anything the Wyoming territory could throw at her. "Then I suppose we'll both make it," she said. Caleb turned to look at her, really look at her, and she met his gaze steadily. In the lamplight, his eyes held warmth she hadn't expected, a kindness that sat oddly with his rough exterior. "I suppose we will," he said softly. The station master emerged from the back room again, this time carrying a bottle and 2 tin cups. He eyed Evelyn and Caleb with open curiosity but said nothing, just set the whiskey on the counter with a thunk. "Storm's settling in," he announced. "You folks might as well get comfortable. It'll be a long night." He wasn't wrong. As the hours crept past, the storm showed no signs of abating. The old woman eventually dozed off in her chair, her knitting sliding into her lap. The station master disappeared into the back room, leaving Evelyn and Caleb alone with the crackling stove and the drumming rain. They talked. Not about anything important at first, just the small observations and questions that helped pass time. Caleb told her about Pine Hollow, about the families she'd be teaching, about the peculiarities of frontier life. He spoke about his ranch with a careful enthusiasm, as if afraid to hope too hard. The land was good, he said, but it was demanding. The cattle were few but healthy. He was building a herd slowly, trading labor for livestock, saving every penny toward expansion. "Takes time," he said, staring into his cup of coffee. He'd declined the whiskey, though he hadn't judged Evelyn for accepting a small pour to warm herself. "Everything out here takes time. The land doesn't care about your hurry." "What about you?" Evelyn asked. "Do you care about hurry?" He smiled faintly. "Used to. The war taught me to move fast, think fast, react fast. But ranching's different. Can't rush a calf being born or grass growing or trust being built. It's all patience and persistence." "That must be difficult," Evelyn said. "After the war." "You have no idea," he replied. And something in his voice made her wonder just how difficult it had been. Was still being. She told him about Boston, though she kept the details vague. About the social expectations, the suffocating propriety, the sense that her entire life had been choreographed before she was old enough to have an opinion. About her love of books and learning, how teaching had always appealed to her but had been considered beneath her station. "Station," Caleb repeated, making it sound faintly ridiculous. "Out here, nobody cares about station, just whether you can do the work." "I like that," Evelyn said, and realized it was true. The thought of being judged solely on her competence rather than her connections or her marriageability felt almost liberating. "You'll do fine," Caleb said with unexpected confidence. "The kids need a good teacher. Lord knows most of them can't read beyond their names. You'll make a difference." "I hope so." She paused, then asked the question that had been bothering her since he'd first picked up the needle. "Caleb, can I ask you something? Seems only fair since I've been asking you things all night. Your hands, the shaking, is it—" She stopped, unsure how to phrase it delicately. "From the war," he finished for her. His voice was matter-of-fact, but she saw tension in his shoulders. "Comes and goes. Gets worse when I'm tired or cold or trying to do delicate work. Doctor says it's my nerves. Says it might get better with time, might not. Does it bother you?" As soon as she asked, she realized how stupid the question was. "I'm sorry, that's—" "No, it's all right." He flexed his hands, watching them in the lamplight. The tremor was barely visible now, just a slight unsteadiness. "Yeah, it bothers me. Not being able to control my own damn hands makes me feel weak." "You're not weak," Evelyn said firmly. "Weakness is running from difficulty. You're here, building something, fighting for it. That's the opposite of weak." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kindness, it's observation." She held his gaze. "We all carry our wounds, Caleb. Yours just happen to be more visible than most." Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or gratitude. "What are your wounds, Evelyn? The ones nobody can see?" She should have deflected, should have laughed it off or changed the subject. Instead, she found herself saying, "I was engaged to a man named Thomas Whitmore. He left me at the altar, literally. Sent his brother with a note saying he'd realized he'd made a mistake, that he couldn't marry me after all." Caleb's face hardened. "That's humiliating? Devastating?" "Yes." The words came easier than she'd expected. Maybe it was the late hour, or the storm, or the fact that Caleb was a stranger she'd likely never see again after tonight. Everyone knew, the guests, the society pages, every gossip in Boston. I became a cautionary tale. The girl who wasn't good enough, who'd done something wrong, though no one could quite say what. "That wasn't your fault," Caleb said, his voice hard. "Man's a coward." "Maybe. Or maybe he saw something I didn't, some flaw that disqualified me." She'd spent months trying to figure it out, analyzing every conversation, every interaction, trying to find the moment where she'd failed. "Or maybe," Caleb said slowly, "he was just a fool who didn't deserve you in the first place." Evelyn blinked, surprised by the vehemence in his tone. "You don't know me well enough to say that." "Don't need to. Anyone who'd leave a woman like you standing at the altar is a fool. That's just fact." The certainty in his voice did something strange to her chest, warmed it, and bruised it at the same time. "Thank you," she managed. "Welcome." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "For what it's worth, I'm glad he was a fool. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here." "Here in Wyoming?" "Here in this station house, talking to me, fixing my shirt." He smiled slightly. "Might be selfish, but I'm grateful for it." Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the stove. "That is rather selfish," she said, but she was smiling too. Outside, the storm finally began to ease. The thunder grew more distant, the lightning less frequent. Rain still fell, but gentler now, a steady patter instead of a hammering assault. Dawn was still hours away, but the worst had passed. "Looks like we'll make it through," Caleb observed, moving back to the window. "Did you doubt we would?" "Always doubt," he said, "until I don't have to anymore." Evelyn joined him at the window again, watching the darkness slowly shift from absolute black to charcoal gray. Out there, somewhere in that vast emptiness, was her new life. Her schoolhouse, her students, her chance to prove she was more than a society girl with a broken engagement. "I'm glad I met you tonight," she said quietly. "It makes the territory feel less daunting." "Same," Caleb replied. "Though I should warn you, when you get to Pine Hollow, people will talk. Small town, nothing to do but gossip. They'll probably have us married off by Sunday." Evelyn laughed, though the thought sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach. "Let them talk. I'm done caring what people think." "Good. That'll serve you well out here." He turned to face her fully. "Evelyn, I know this is forward, but would you let me take you to Pine Hollow when the storm clears? I'm headed that way anyway, and the stage might not run for another day or two. Plus, my wagon's a damn sight more comfortable than that rattletrap coach." She should say no, should insist on propriety, on waiting for the proper transportation, on maintaining the careful distance society demanded. But Evelyn Moore was tired of should, tired of proper, tired of caring about rules that had never protected her from anything that mattered. "I'd appreciate that," she said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said with a slight grin. "You haven't seen my wagon. It's held together mostly by hope and baling wire." "Then it'll fit right in with the rest of my life," Evelyn replied, and they both laughed, the sound warm and easy in the close space of the station house. The old woman stirred in her chair, knitting, sliding off her lap entirely now. The stove popped and settled, and outside the rain continued its gentle fall, washing the prairie clean, preparing the ground for whatever was coming next. Evelyn didn't know what the future held. Didn't know if she'd succeed as a teacher, if she'd survive the harsh winters Caleb had warned her about, if she'd ever truly escape the shadow of her past. But for the first time in months, she felt something other than dread when she thought about tomorrow. She felt possibility. And sitting in a rough station house at the edge of nowhere, watching a cowboy flex his trembling hands while dawn slowly approached, Evelyn Moore realized something that should have terrified her. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Dawn broke pale and hesitant over the Wyoming prairie. The sky washed clean to a fragile blue that seemed almost apologetic after the violence of the night before. Evelyn stood outside the station house, breathing air so crisp it made her lungs ache, watching Caleb hitch his horses to a wagon that did indeed look held together by hope and very little else. The wagon bed was scarred and weathered, the wheels slightly uneven, and one of the side panels had been replaced with wood that didn't quite match the rest. But the horses were fine animals, a matched pair of chestnuts with intelligent eyes and well-kept coats that spoke of an owner who prioritized his livestock over his equipment. "Told you it wasn't much," Caleb said, catching her expression. He'd changed into the shirt she'd mended, and in the morning light she could barely see her stitches. "But she'll get us there. Always has." "I wasn't judging," Evelyn said quickly, "just observing. Observing looks a lot like judging from where I'm standing." But he was smiling as he said it, taking the sting from the words. He'd retrieved his hat from inside, a wide-brimmed affair darkened by rain and shaped by years of use, and it shadowed his face in a way that made him look older, more serious. "You ready?" Evelyn glanced back at the station house, where the stage driver was arguing with the station master about axles and mud and something called a singletree that she didn't understand. The old woman had departed with the dawn, picked up by a son who'd driven a buckboard through the worst of the storm without a word of complaint. That left only Evelyn and Caleb, and the choice that suddenly felt more significant than it should. "I'm ready," she said, and let him hand her up onto the wagon seat. His hands were steady this morning, she noticed. The tremor from last night had faded to almost nothing, though she saw him flex his fingers once before taking up the reins as if checking to make sure they'd obey. The gesture was so unconscious, so habitual, that it made her chest ache. The wagon lurched into motion with a creak of wood and leather that sounded like it might be the vehicle's last breath. But the horses leaned into their harness with easy strength, and soon they were rolling across the prairie at a steady clip, the station house falling away behind them like a memory already fading. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. Evelyn was too busy taking in the landscape, the endless roll of grass still heavy with rain, the mountains rising in the distance like the backbone of some sleeping giant, the sky so vast it made her feel both insignificant and strangely free. Everything was bigger here, wider. The horizon seemed impossibly far away, as if you could walk forever and never reach it. "Gets to people," Caleb said, breaking the silence. "The openness. Some folks can't stand it, makes them feel too small, too exposed. They end up going back east where there are walls and limits." "And you?" Evelyn asked. "Does it bother you?" "No." He said it with certainty, his eyes scanning the prairie with the ease of long familiarity. "I like knowing I can see what's coming. In the war, everything was close. Trees, buildings, smoke so thick you couldn't see 5 feet ahead. Men died because they couldn't see what was waiting around the corner. Out here, there are no corners. No surprises." Evelyn thought about that. "Except storms." He laughed, a short bark of sound. "Except storms. And cattle rustlers. And the occasional band of Lakota who don't appreciate ranchers settling on what used to be their hunting grounds, though I can't say I blame them for that." "Are there many conflicts?" Evelyn asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. She'd heard stories back east, lurid tales of scalping and massacres that her friends had whispered over tea, but Caleb's tone suggested something more complicated than the simple savagery those stories had implied. "Some. Less than there used to be, more than there should be." He guided the horses around a particularly deep rut in the road, his hands gentle on the reins. "Most of the tribes have been pushed onto reservations now. Government promises them supplies and support, then conveniently forgets to deliver half the time. Creates bad blood all around." "That seems unjust," Evelyn said. Caleb glanced at her with something like approval. "It is. But justice and the frontier don't always overlap, Miss Moore. You'll learn that soon enough." They rode in silence for another stretch, the only sounds the creak of the wagon, the steady clop of hooves, and the whisper of wind through grass. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, pulling steam from the sodden earth. Evelyn's dress was still damp, and she shivered despite the growing warmth. Without a word, Caleb reached behind the seat and pulled out a blanket. It was rough wool, faded and worn, but clean. He handed it to her with a careful courtesy that reminded her he'd been raised with manners, even if the frontier had worn away most of the polish. "Thank you," she said, draping it over her shoulders. It smelled faintly of horse and sage, not unpleasant, just different from the lavender sachets that had scented everything in her old life. "Can't have the new schoolteacher catching her death before she even starts teaching," Caleb said. "The town council would have my hide." "Is there actually a town council?" Evelyn asked. "Or is that just what people call the men who gather at the saloon?" He grinned. "Little of both. There's a mayor, Samuel Boone owns the general store, and a few other men who think their opinions matter more than everyone else's. But decisions mostly get made wherever folks happen to be gathered. Democracy by proximity. Sounds chaotic. It is. But it works. Mostly." He steered the horses onto a slightly firmer patch of ground, the wagon's rattling easing a fraction. "You'll meet them all soon enough. Mayor Boone's wife, Margaret, she's the one who organized the search for a new teacher. She'll probably descend on you like a mother hen within an hour of your arrival." "Is that a warning?" Evelyn asked, amused despite herself. "More like preparation. Margaret means well, but she can be intense. Wants everything done properly by the book." She's originally from Philadelphia, still hasn't quite adjusted to the reality that out here, the book doesn't always apply. Evelyn understood that tension already. I'll do my best not to disappoint her. You won't, Caleb said with unexpected conviction. You fixed my shirt in the dark with hands steadier than a surgeon's. You'll handle Margaret Boone just fine. The confidence in his voice warmed her more than the blanket did. They fell into an easy conversation after that, Caleb pointing out landmarks that all looked the same to Evelyn's untrained eye. A particular rise that meant water, a cluster of rocks that served as a boundary marker, the distant line of cottonwoods that indicated a creek. He spoke about his ranch with cautious pride, describing the small cabin he'd built himself, the barn he was still working on, the plans he had for expansion if the herd survived the winter. You talk about winter like it's a war, Evelyn observed. It is, Caleb said flatly. Out here, winter kills more people than anything else. Cold, snow, isolation. Folks get snowed in for weeks, run out of supplies, freeze to death 20 feet from their own door because they got disoriented in a whiteout. That's why everyone builds up stores in fall, why neighbors check on each other, why you don't take risks when the snow starts flying. You're trying to scare me again, Evelyn said. I'm trying to prepare you. There's a difference. He looked at her seriously. The schoolhouse is in town, so you'll be better off than most. But you need to understand what you're facing. This territory doesn't forgive mistakes. Neither did Boston society, Evelyn replied. And I survived that. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Respect, maybe, or understanding. Fair point, though I'd wager Wyoming winters are more merciful than Boston gossips. You'd lose that wager, Evelyn said, and they both smiled. Around mid-morning, they stopped to rest the horses by a small creek that had swollen with the previous night's rain. Caleb unhitched the team and let them drink while Evelyn stretched her legs, grateful to be off the hard wagon seat. Her back ached, her dress was hopelessly ruined, and she was fairly certain she'd never felt more alive. Caleb produced a canteen and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were biscuits, hard and plain, but edible, and some dried meat that he apologized for even as he offered it. Not exactly a Boston breakfast, he said. No, Evelyn agreed, biting into a biscuit that tasted of salt and not much else. But it serves its purpose. They ate standing by the creek, watching the water rush past, carrying branches and debris from upstream. The sun was warm now, burning off the last of the morning chill, and Evelyn felt the tension of the previous night finally beginning to ease from her shoulders. Can I ask you something? Caleb said after a while, his voice careful. You've been asking me things all morning, Evelyn pointed out. This is different, more personal. He paused, as if weighing his words. That man who left you. Thomas. You said everyone knew. Does that mean your name was in the papers? Evelyn felt heat crawl up her neck. Yes, the society pages loved it. Miss Evelyn Moore, daughter of Edmund Moore, was left waiting at St. Matthew's Church yesterday when her intended, Mr. Thomas Whitmore, failed to appear. Sources suggest the engagement has been terminated. They made it sound like a business transaction gone wrong. That's why you came out here, Caleb said slowly. Not just for opportunity, to get away from all that. Wouldn't you? Evelyn asked, hearing the edge in her own voice. If every time you walked down the street, people whispered? If your friends stopped calling, your invitations dried up, and your own father looked at you with pity at breakfast? I couldn't breathe there anymore, Caleb. Every day felt like drowning. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, I understand that. After the war, I couldn't go back to Virginia. Too many ghosts, too many memories of who I'd been before and what I'd done during. I needed somewhere I could just be Caleb Rhodes, rancher. Not Caleb Rhodes, veteran. Not Caleb Rhodes, the man who... He stopped abruptly, his jaw tightening. Evelyn waited, but he didn't continue. Instead, he gathered up the remains of their breakfast and repacked the bundle with movements that were a little too precise, a little too controlled. We should get moving, he said. Still got a few hours to Pine Hollow. They hitched the horses again and continued on, but something had shifted between them. The easy conversation had been replaced by a thoughtful silence, both of them lost in their own histories. Evelyn found herself watching Caleb's profile as he drove, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, the careful way he held the reins to compensate for the tremor in his hands. He was handsome, she realized with a start. Not in the polished, studied way Thomas had been handsome, with his carefully pomaded hair and expensive suits. Caleb's appeal was rougher, more honest, the face of a man who'd lived hard and survived it, who carried his scars openly because hiding them would have been more work than they were worth. "You're staring," Caleb said without looking at her. Evelyn felt her cheeks flame. "I was just thinking." Dangerous occupation, thinking. Says the man who's been lost in his own thoughts for the past half hour. He smiled slightly. Fair point. He was quiet for another moment, then added, "What were you thinking about, if you don't mind my asking?" Evelyn considered lying, offering some innocuous observation about the landscape or the weather. But something about this man, this journey, seemed to demand honesty. "I was thinking that you're not what I expected," she said carefully. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone rougher, I suppose, more uncivilized. The stories back east make Western men sound like barely reformed savages." Caleb laughed, a genuine sound this time. "Some of us are, but most of us are just trying to get by, same as anywhere else. We might not use the right fork at dinner, but we know how to treat people decently." "Thomas used the right fork," Evelyn said quietly. "He knew which wine to serve with which course. He could waltz beautifully and quote poetry and discuss philosophy, but when it mattered, when it came to basic decency, he was the savage." Caleb turned to look at her fully, and the understanding in his eyes was almost too much to bear. "Civilization's not about forks and wine, Evelyn. It's about how you treat people when no one's watching, when it costs you something to be decent." "Is that why you stopped to help me with my bag yesterday?" she asked. "At the station?" He looked confused. "I didn't help you with your bag." "No, but you moved your rifle when I came in, angled it away so it wouldn't point at me, even by accident. You probably don't even remember doing it." Caleb blinked, clearly surprised she'd noticed. "That's just common sense. You don't point weapons at people." "Exactly. Civilization." Evelyn smiled. Thomas never would have thought of that. He'd never held anything more dangerous than a letter opener. "And you prefer the man with the rifle?" Caleb asked, and there was something vulnerable in the question, hidden beneath the casual tone. Evelyn met his gaze steadily. "I prefer the man who thinks of others even when he doesn't have to. The weapon is irrelevant." Color rose in Caleb's weathered cheeks, and he looked away, focusing intently on the horses. But Evelyn saw the smile he was trying to hide, and something warm unfurled in her chest. By early afternoon, the landscape began to change. The endless prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with scrub pine and juniper. They passed a few homesteads, rough cabins with smoke rising from stone chimneys, small gardens already turning brown with the approach of fall. People waved from doorways and fields, and Caleb waved back, sometimes calling out names. "Everyone knows you," Evelyn observed. "Small territory. Everyone knows everyone, whether they want to or not." He pointed to a cabin set back from the road, larger than most, with a proper barn and several outbuildings. "That's the Johnson place. 3 kids you'll be teaching. Good family, hardworking. Father was a Buffalo soldier, came out here after his service ended." "Buffalo soldier?" Evelyn repeated. "Black Cavalry Regiment, fought in the Indian Wars mostly. Henry Johnson served with honor, got his land grant, and carved out a good life. Not everyone was happy about it. There's still plenty of prejudice out here, but Henry's too stubborn to care, and his wife Sarah could outshoot half the men in the county. People learned to keep their opinions to themselves." Evelyn heard the approval in his voice. "You like them." "I respect them. There's a difference." He glanced at her. "You'll find Pine Hollow's got all kinds. Folks from back east like you and Margaret Boone, immigrants from Germany and Sweden and Ireland, former slaves who came west looking for freedom, Chinese workers who stayed after the railroad moved on, Mormons, Catholics, Methodists, and more than a few who don't believe in much beyond hard work and whiskey. It's a strange mix, but it mostly works." "Mostly?" "There's always friction. People are people, and fear and prejudice don't disappear just because you move west. But out here, you need your neighbors. That tends to smooth over a lot of rough edges real quick." They crested a hill, and suddenly Pine Hollow spread out before them, a collection of buildings that seemed almost accidental, as if they'd been scattered by a careless hand and had simply decided to stay put. A main street ran through the center, lined with false-fronted buildings that tried valiantly to suggest permanence. Evelyn could make out a general store, a saloon, a building that might have been a hotel, and several others whose purposes weren't immediately clear. At the far end of town stood a white church, its steeple reaching optimistically toward the sky, and beside it, a smaller building with a bell mounted on the roof. "That's the schoolhouse," Caleb said, following her gaze. "Built it 3 years ago. You'll have about 20 students, ages 6 to 14. Some come regular, some only when the farm work allows. You'll need to be flexible." Evelyn stared at the little building that would be her responsibility, her purpose, her redemption or her ruin. It looked impossibly small from this distance, impossibly fragile against the backdrop of mountains and sky. "I can do this," she said, more to herself than to Caleb. "I know you can," he replied simply. They rolled down the hill into Pine Hollow, and immediately Evelyn felt eyes on them. People emerged from buildings, paused in their work, turned to watch the wagon pass. She saw curiosity on some faces, calculation on others. A few women whispered to each other behind raised hands. "Told you," Caleb murmured. "Small town. You're the most interesting thing to happen since the preacher's wife ran off with a whiskey drummer last spring." "That's quite a story," Evelyn said faintly. "You should hear the version where she was actually kidnapped by bandits, and the preacher's covering it up to save face. That one's even better." Despite her nervousness, Evelyn smiled. "Which version is true?" "Probably neither. Truth's usually less interesting than the gossip." He guided the horses toward a neat building with a sign reading Boone's Mercantile. "Here we go. Prepare yourself for Margaret." He'd barely set the brake when the door of the mercantile flew open and a woman emerged like a force of nature. She was short, round, and moved with the kind of determined energy that suggested she'd been waiting impatiently for their arrival. Her dress was impeccable, despite the frontier setting, her hair perfectly arranged beneath a fashionable hat. "Miss Moore," she called before Evelyn had even climbed down from the wagon. "Oh, we've been so worried. When the stage didn't arrive yesterday, we feared the worst. Mr. Rhodes, thank heavens you found her." "Found her at Bridger's Station, Mrs. Boone," Caleb said, helping Evelyn down with a steadying hand. "Storm stranded us both. Figured I'd save the stage company the trouble and bring her in myself." Margaret Boone looked between them with eyes that missed nothing. "How fortunate," she said, in a tone that suggested she was already constructing several different narratives about what stranded might mean. "Well, Miss Moore, you must be exhausted. Come inside, we'll get you settled. Mr. Rhodes, thank you for your assistance." It was a dismissal, polite but firm. Caleb recognized it and tipped his hat. "My pleasure, Mrs. Boone. Miss Moore, welcome to Pine Hollow. I'm sure I'll be seeing you around." "Thank you for everything," Evelyn said, meaning it more than the simple words could convey. "I truly appreciate your kindness." Something passed between them. An understanding, a recognition, a possibility neither of them was quite ready to name. Then Caleb climbed back onto his wagon, clicked to his horses, and rolled away down the street. Evelyn watched him go longer than was probably proper. "Well," Margaret Boone said briskly, taking Evelyn's arm and steering her toward the store. "Let's get you inside and hear all about your journey. I'm sure it was quite an adventure." It was, Evelyn thought, though perhaps not in the way Margaret imagined. Inside the mercantile, Evelyn was introduced to Mayor Boone, a quiet man who seemed content to let his wife handle most interactions, and shown to a room above the store that would be hers until more permanent arrangements could be made. It was small but clean, with a real bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the main street. Margaret provided fresh water, clean towels, and a seemingly endless stream of information about the town, the school, and the families Evelyn would be teaching. She spoke of curricula and supplies, of challenges and expectations, of propriety and reputation, with an emphasis that made Evelyn understand that her arrival with Caleb Rhodes had not gone unnoticed. "Mr. Rhodes is a good man," Margaret said carefully as she helped Evelyn unpack her ruined carpetbag. "But he's also unmarried, and, well, there are standards we must maintain. As the school teacher, You'll be looked to as an example for the children. Any hint of impropriety—" "Mrs. Boone," Evelyn interrupted gently, "I spent the night in a public station house with 2 other travelers and a station master. Mr. Rhodes was kind enough to offer me transportation when the stage was delayed. Nothing untoward occurred, and I hope the people of Pine Hollow are sensible enough not to manufacture scandal where none exists." Margaret blinked, clearly unused to being interrupted. Then she smiled. "You have a spine, Miss Moore. Good. You'll need it. Some of the parents can be challenging, and the children themselves have been without proper instruction for 6 months. You'll have your work cut out for you." "I'm ready," Evelyn said, and realized she meant it. Over the next few hours, Margaret paraded Evelyn around town, introducing her to what seemed like every resident of Pine Hollow. There was Dr. Chen, whose medical practice occupied a small building near the hotel. Sarah and Henry Johnson, who'd driven in from their homestead specifically to meet the new teacher, and whose 3 children, Grace, Samuel, and little Thomas, regarded Evelyn with cautious hope. The Andersons, the Schmidts, the O'Malleys, the Larkins, names and faces blurred together until Evelyn's head spun. But through it all, she found herself looking for one particular face, one tall figure in a battered hat. Caleb had said he lived 5 miles out, but surely he'd need to come to town for supplies or— "Looking for someone, Miss Moore?" Margaret asked archly. Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Just trying to orient myself. Everything's so different from Boston." Margaret said, clearly unconvinced. "Well, Mr. Rhodes typically comes to town on Saturdays for supplies. That's 2 days from now, if you were wondering." "I wasn't—" Evelyn started, then stopped. There was no point in denying what was apparently written all over her face. "He was very kind to me, Mrs. Boone. I'd like to thank him properly." "Of course," Margaret said, her expression softening slightly. "As I said, he's a good man. Had a hard time of it since the war, but he's working hard to build something solid. The ranch is coming along nicely from what Samuel tells me." Evelyn wanted to ask more about the war, about what kind of hard time Caleb had faced, about whether the tremor in his hands was common knowledge or something he tried to hide. But Margaret was already moving on, steering Evelyn toward the schoolhouse with fresh energy. The building was even smaller up close than it had appeared from the hill. One room with rough-hewn benches for the students and a desk at the front for the teacher. A pot-bellied stove crouched in the corner, unlit now, but essential come winter. Slates and chalk were stacked on a shelf, along with a few battered primers and a McGuffey reader that had seen better days. "It's not much," Margaret admitted, seeing Evelyn's expression. "But it's yours. The town pays $20 a month plus room and board. You'll take your meals with different families on a rotating basis. It's how we managed with the previous teacher, and it gives you a chance to know the children in their home environments." $20 a month. Evelyn had spent more than that on a single pair of gloves in Boston. But here, in this rough little building that smelled of chalk and wood smoke and possibility, it felt like a fortune. "It's perfect," she said honestly. Margaret looked pleased. "School starts Monday. That gives you the weekend to prepare. I'll have my husband bring over supplies tomorrow. Paper, more chalk, whatever you need within reason. The children are eager to learn, Miss Moore. Don't let them fool you into thinking otherwise." After Margaret finally left her alone, Evelyn stood in the empty schoolhouse, running her hand over the teacher's desk. The wood was scarred and stained, marked by the dozens of students who'd carved their initials or drawn pictures when the teacher wasn't looking. Evidence of life, of learning, of children becoming themselves. She thought of Thomas, who'd wanted her to be an ornament, a beautiful accessory to display at parties and dinners, who'd never asked what she wanted, what she dreamed about, what made her feel alive. And she thought of Caleb, who'd listened to her talk about books and teaching with genuine interest, who'd trusted her with his own vulnerabilities, who'd looked at her not as an object to possess, but as a person to know. The difference was staggering. Through the schoolhouse window, she could see the mountains in the distance, purple with shadow and possibility. Somewhere out there, 5 miles from town, Caleb Rhodes was probably working on his barn or tending his cattle or fighting against the tremor in his hands to accomplish some task that should have been simple but wasn't. And Evelyn Moore, former Boston socialite and abandoned bride, stood in a frontier schoolhouse and smiled. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with frost silvering the grass and her breath clouding in the air. Evelyn woke early, too nervous to sleep, and dressed carefully in her least damaged dress. She'd spent Friday preparing the schoolhouse, arranging desks, taking inventory of supplies, and planning lessons that would work for children of wildly different ages and abilities. But today was Saturday, Supply Day. The day Caleb came to town. She told herself she was just being friendly, that it was only proper to thank him again for his help, that her interest was purely platonic, a natural gratitude for kindness received. She told herself these things while carefully arranging her hair, while pinching her cheeks for color, while checking her reflection in the small mirror 3 separate times. She was a terrible liar, even to herself. The mercantile was busy when she arrived, farmers and ranchers stocking up for the week ahead. Evelyn pretended to browse the limited selection of books while keeping one eye on the door. An hour passed. Then another. She bought a novel she didn't need with money she could barely spare, just to justify her lingering presence. "He'll be here," Margaret Boone said quietly, appearing at Evelyn's elbow with the stealth of a woman who'd perfected the art of knowing everything about everyone. "Mr. Rhodes is reliable. If he says Saturday, he means Saturday." Evelyn wanted to deny that she was waiting for anyone in particular, but Margaret's knowing smile made the denial pointless. "I simply wanted to thank him," she said with as much dignity as she could muster. "Of course you did, dear." Another half hour crawled past. Evelyn was seriously considering abandoning her vigil when the mercantile door opened and Caleb walked in, bringing with him the smell of horse and leather and the outdoors. He looked tired, she thought, lines of strain around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 days ago. But when he saw her, those lines eased and something in her chest loosened in response. "Miss Moore," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I needed a book," she said, holding up her purchase as proof. "And I wanted to thank you again, for everything." "Already thanked me," he replied, but he was smiling. "Multiple times, as I recall." "Then consider this a reminder that your kindness hasn't been forgotten." They stood there, aware of Margaret watching from behind the counter, aware of other customers trying not to stare, aware that whatever was happening between them was happening in the most public way possible. In Boston, there would have been rules for this, calling cards and chaperones and carefully orchestrated meetings. Here, there was just the two of them, and the truth hanging in the air between them. "Would you like to walk?" Caleb asked abruptly. "I mean, if you're not busy, I could show you around town proper, the parts Margaret probably didn't cover." Evelyn knew she should hesitate, should consider propriety and reputation and all the things Margaret had warned her about. Instead, she said, "I'd like that very much." They left the mercantile together, and Evelyn didn't have to look back to know that Margaret Boone was already calculating when the wedding would be. Pine Hollow looked different walking beside Caleb than it had during Margaret's brisk tour. The building seemed less ramshackle, more like evidence of stubborn determination. The muddy street became a testament to persistence rather than primitiveness. Or maybe, Evelyn thought, it was simply that everything looked different when you weren't alone. They walked slowly, Caleb pointing out details Margaret had glossed over. The poker game that ran every Thursday night in the back room of the saloon, the spot behind the livery where kids snuck off to smoke stolen cigarettes, the rain barrel where Mrs. Anderson was convinced she'd seen a ghost last winter, though it had probably just been her own reflection in the ice. "You know everyone's secrets," Evelyn observed. "Small town," Caleb said with a shrug. "Secrets don't last long. By Monday, everyone will know we're walking together. By Tuesday, there'll be 3 different versions of why, each more scandalous than the last." "Does that bother you?" Evelyn asked. "The gossip?" He was quiet for a moment, steering them around a particularly deep puddle. "Used to. When I first came here, every whisper felt like an accusation. But I learned that people talk because they're bored, not because they actually care. And the ones whose opinions matter don't put much stock in gossip anyway." They'd reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie. A small creek ran through a stand of cottonwoods, and someone had built a rough bench overlooking the water. Caleb gestured to it, and they sat, the wood cold even through Evelyn's skirts. "This is where I come when town gets too loud," he admitted. "It's peaceful here." It was peaceful. The creek burbled over stones, and somewhere in the trees a bird called with a sound Evelyn didn't recognize. The morning sun slanted through the branches, dappling everything with gold. In the distance, the mountains stood sentinel, unchanged and unchanging. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said after a while. "Seems to be a habit of yours?" But Caleb was smiling. "The tremor in your hands. Does it hurt?" His smile faded. He looked down at his hands, flexing them slowly. In the clear morning light, she could see the slight shake, more pronounced in his right hand than his left. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't hurt, not physically. It's just there. Some days barely noticeable, other days I can't hold a coffee cup steady. The doc says it's nerves damaged in the war, might heal over time, might not." "What happened?" Evelyn asked gently. "If you don't mind talking about it." Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he took a breath, and the words came slowly, reluctantly, like they'd been locked away for years. "I was a sharpshooter. Third day of Gettysburg. They put me in a barn loft with a rifle and told me to thin out the Confederate artillery crews. I was good at it, Evelyn. Too good. I could put a bullet through a man's eye from 300 yards. I did it for 3 days straight, and when it was over, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Haven't stopped since." The raw honesty of it stole Evelyn's breath. She'd known he was a veteran, but the reality of what that meant, the things he'd seen, the things he'd done, suddenly became terrifyingly real. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be." His voice was harder now. "I knew what I was signing up for, and the Union needed sharpshooters, needed men willing to kill from a distance, clean and efficient. I did my duty. But doing your duty doesn't mean it doesn't cost you something." Evelyn reached out slowly, carefully, and took his shaking hand in hers. He went very still, as if afraid any movement might break whatever fragile understanding they'd found. "You're not that person anymore," she said. "How do you know?" The question was almost desperate. "How do you know the war didn't hollow me out, leave me with nothing but scars and tremors and the memory of pulling a trigger?" "Because you moved your rifle when I walked into that station house," Evelyn said firmly. "Because you care about whether your horses are comfortable. Because you spoke about Henry Johnson with respect and the Lakota with understanding. Because you're here, building something instead of destroying. That's how I know." Caleb looked at her with something like wonder. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Evelyn replied. "Sometimes you just know." They sat there, hands clasped, while the creek ran and the birds sang, and Pine Hollow went about its Saturday business behind them. It should have felt awkward, or too intimate or wrong in a dozen different ways. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Tell me about your ranch," Evelyn said eventually, not pulling her hand away. "What's it really like? Not the polite version you gave Mrs. Boone." Caleb laughed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "It's a mess. Beautiful, but a mess. Got about 50 head of cattle, half of them ornery as hell. The cabin leaks when it rains hard, and the barn's only 3/4 finished because I ran out of lumber and money at the same time. Winter's going to be hard. It always is the first few years, or so I'm told." "But you love it," Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. "I do. When I wake up in the morning and step outside and it's just me and the land and the work that needs doing, it's the first time since the war I've felt like myself. Like Caleb Rhodes the person, not Caleb Rhodes the killer, or the veteran, or the man with shaking hands. Just me." "I understand that," Evelyn said softly. "That's what the schoolhouse feels like. When I'm in there, preparing lessons, imagining the children learning, I'm not the woman who was left at the altar. I'm not the society scandal or the spinster who had to run away. I'm just a teacher. It's enough." "It's more than enough," Caleb said, turning to look at her fully. "You're more than enough, Evelyn. I hope you know that." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. This was dangerous, she knew. It was too fast, too soon, too public. She'd been in Pine Hollow for 3 days. She barely knew this man. Every rule of propriety she'd ever learned was screaming at her to pull her hand away, to stand up, to put distance between them before this thing, whatever it was, could take root and grow. Instead, she squeezed his hand tighter and said, "So are you." The spell broke when they heard voices approaching, children's voices, high and excited. Evelyn and Caleb sprang apart like guilty teenagers, putting a respectable distance between them just as three kids burst through the cottonwoods. Evelyn recognized them from Margaret's introductions, the Johnson children, Grace, Samuel, and little Thomas. "Mr. Rhodes," Samuel called, skidding to a stop when he saw them. "And Miss Moore, we were looking for crawdads in the creek. Want to see?" "Mind your manners, Samuel," Grace said, trying for grown-up authority despite being only 12. "Hello, Mr. Rhodes. Hello, Miss Moore. We didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting," Evelyn said, though her cheeks felt warm. "What are crawdads?" All three children stared at her like she'd announced she didn't know what the sun was. "You don't know crawdads?" little Thomas asked, his eyes wide. "They're the best thing in the whole creek." "Then you'll have to show me," Evelyn said, standing and brushing off her skirts. "I'm afraid my education is sadly lacking in crawdad knowledge." The children lit up like lanterns, and for the next hour, Evelyn found herself crouched by the creek, learning to spot the little creatures hiding under rocks. Grace proved to be a patient teacher, showing Evelyn how to approach without startling them. Samuel provided running commentary on crawdad behavior and habitats with the confidence of an expert, and Thomas mostly splashed in the shallow water, getting his pants soaked and not caring a bit. Caleb watched with barely concealed amusement, occasionally offering advice, but mostly letting the children conduct the lesson. When Evelyn finally managed to catch a crawdad, a small gray-brown thing that immediately tried to pinch her, she held it up triumphantly. "I did it!" "That's a fine one, Miss Moore," Grace said approvingly. "You're a natural." "High praise," Caleb murmured to Evelyn as the children raced off to find more. "Grace doesn't compliment lightly." "I'll treasure it forever," Evelyn replied, carefully releasing the crawdad back into the water. Her hands were muddy, her dress was wet at the hem, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this happy. The children's mother, Sarah Johnson, appeared shortly after, calling them home for lunch. She greeted Evelyn and Caleb with a warmth that suggested she either hadn't heard the gossip yet or didn't care about it. "I hope they weren't bothering you," she said. "Not at all," Evelyn assured her. "They were teaching me about crawdads, very important knowledge for a school teacher." Sarah laughed, a rich sound full of genuine mirth. If only all learning could happen at a creek. "Grace, Samuel, Thomas, come on, your father's waiting." She paused, then added quietly, "Miss Moore, we're glad you're here. The children need someone who'll take time with them. Not everyone would." The simple statement carried weight Evelyn didn't fully understand until later, when Caleb explained that the previous teacher had refused to teach the Johnson children, claiming they were too different from the white students. The town council had sent him packing within a week, but the damage had been done. "That's unconscionable," Evelyn said, anger heating her voice. "That's prejudice," Caleb replied. "It exists out here same as anywhere, just in different forms. But you'll do better. I know you will." They walked back toward town slowly, neither of them quite ready for the morning to end. As they neared the mercantile, Caleb seemed to struggle with something, his jaw working as if chewing on words he couldn't quite spit out. "Evelyn," he said finally, "there's a social coming up, 2 weeks from Saturday at the church. Music, dancing, food, the whole town turns out. Would you, that is, if you're not opposed, would you consider letting me escort you?" Evelyn's heart did something complicated in her chest. This was it, the moment where possibility became intention, where a walk and a conversation in muddy hands by a creek transformed into something the town would recognize as courtship. She thought of Thomas, who'd asked her father for permission to court her before ever asking Evelyn herself, who'd orchestrated their entire relationship according to social expectations and family advantage, who'd ultimately decided she wasn't worth the trouble of keeping his promise. Caleb stood before her now, hat in his hands, vulnerability written across his weathered face, asking, not assuming, hoping, not demanding. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I would be honored." Relief flooded his features, followed quickly by a smile that transformed his entire face. "Yeah?" "Yeah," she echoed, smiling back. They stood there grinning at each other like fools until Margaret Boone emerged from the mercantile and cleared her throat meaningfully. "Mr. Rhodes, your supplies are ready. Miss Moore, the mayor was asking for you. Something about the school budget." "Of course," Evelyn said, reluctantly stepping back. Thank you, Mrs. Boone. Caleb settled his hat back on his head, the motion somehow both casual and final. I'll see you at the social then. 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Evelyn confirmed. He loaded his supplies onto his wagon while she pretended not to watch, then climbed up onto the seat with the ease of long practice. The horses knew the way home and started forward without prompting. Caleb looked back once, caught her eye, and touched the brim of his hat in farewell. That can wait. What I really want to know is everything that happened at that creek. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Evelyn threw herself into teaching with an energy that surprised even her. The first day of school had been chaotic. 20 children ranging from 6 to 14, some who could barely write their names and others who were reading at levels far beyond their age. But she'd managed, finding ways to group them by ability rather than age, giving the older students responsibility for helping the younger ones, turning the one-room chaos into something resembling order. The children tested her, of course. Samuel Johnson put a frog in her desk drawer. Katie Anderson pretended she couldn't read until Evelyn caught her devouring a dime novel during recess. The Schmidt boys spoke only German to each other and claimed not to understand English, though they clearly understood every word she said. But slowly, grudgingly, they began to trust her, to try, to learn. Grace Johnson proved to be a natural scholar, devouring every book Evelyn could find and asking questions that challenged even Evelyn's understanding. Young Thomas struggled with letters but could solve arithmetic problems in his head faster than anyone else. Katie Anderson, once she dropped the pretense, wrote stories that were surprisingly sophisticated. Every evening, Evelyn took dinner with a different family, learning the rhythms of frontier life. She ate venison with the Andersons, learned to make strudel with the Schmidts, and listened to Henry Johnson tell stories about his time in the cavalry that made the children's eyes go wide. And through it all, she thought about the social, about music and dancing and Caleb's hand in hers. Margaret helped her alter one of her better dresses, letting out the hem that had been ruined in the mud and adding some lace at the collar. It wasn't fancy by Boston standards, nothing out here was, but it was pretty. And when Evelyn looked at herself in the mirror, she saw someone different from the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach 3 weeks ago. That woman had been running. This woman was standing still and building something. The morning of the social dawned clear and cold, autumn asserting itself with frost and wind that stripped the last leaves from the cottonwoods. Evelyn woke with butterflies rioting in her stomach, feeling foolish and giddy and terrified all at once. You'd think I'd never been to a dance before, she muttered to her reflection as she tried for the third time to arrange her hair in a way that looked intentional rather than desperate. But she had been to dances, dozens of them, Boston society balls where everything was choreographed and controlled, where every step followed rules laid down by generations of propriety, where she'd waltzed with Thomas and felt nothing but the pressure of expectations. This felt different. This felt real. By 5 o'clock, people were already gathering at the church. Someone had cleared the pews to the sides, creating an open space for dancing. Lanterns hung from the rafters, their warm light pushing back the early evening shadows. A makeshift stage at the far end held 3 musicians, a fiddler, a guitar player, and someone with a battered accordion, who were tuning their instruments with more enthusiasm than precision. Evelyn stood near the doorway, suddenly uncertain. She'd told Caleb she would meet him here, but now that seemed presumptuous. What if he'd changed his mind? What if... You look beautiful. She turned to find Caleb standing behind her, and her breath caught. He'd cleaned up, actually shaved, his hair neatly combed, wearing what was clearly his best shirt. The one she'd mended that first night, she realized with a pang of tenderness. His hands were steady as he offered her his arm. You look rather fine yourself, she managed. Had to do justice to my date, he said, and the word sent warmth flooding through her. Date. Not just an escort or a companion, but something with intention behind it. They entered together and the room went quiet for a heartbeat, that universal pause when everyone registers something worth noticing. Then conversation resumed, but Evelyn felt the weight of attention, the speculation, the judgment, and approval in equal measure. Ignore them, Caleb murmured. Just focus on me. That won't help the gossip, Evelyn pointed out. Let them gossip. I've got the prettiest woman in the territory on my arm. They can say whatever they want. Before Evelyn could respond, Margaret Boone descended upon them with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops. She introduced Evelyn to people she'd already met and several she hadn't, including a weathered rancher named Hank, who owned the spread next to Caleb's. "So you're the one who's got Rhodes all spruced up," Hank said, his eyes twinkling. "About time someone civilized him." "I'm not trying to civilize him," Evelyn said firmly. "I rather like him as he is." Caleb's expression went soft at that, and Hank laughed loud enough to turn heads. "She's a keeper, Rhodes. Don't mess it up." "Working on it," Caleb replied. The musicians struck up a tune, something lively and slightly off-key, but undeniably joyful. Couples moved onto the floor, and Evelyn watched with mingled fascination and trepidation. This wasn't the structured waltz of Boston ballrooms. People were swinging and stomping, laughing when they missed steps, making up moves as they went along. "I should warn you," Caleb said. "I'm not much of a dancer. The hands, and also just general lack of skill." "Then we'll figure it out together," Evelyn replied, pulling him toward the floor before her courage could desert her. The first few minutes were disaster. Caleb's hand shook badly enough that he had trouble maintaining his grip, and Evelyn kept trying to follow Boston waltz patterns that had no place in a frontier social. They stepped on each other's feet, went opposite directions, and nearly collided with the Andersons. But then Caleb laughed, a real unguarded sound, and something in Evelyn relaxed. This wasn't about perfection. It was about movement and music and being together. She stopped trying to remember the proper steps and just followed his lead, or led when he faltered, until they found a rhythm that was entirely their own. They weren't graceful, they weren't even particularly good, but they were together, and that was enough. Between dances, they caught their breath at a table laden with food that represented the entire territory's culinary traditions. German potato salad sat beside Chinese dumplings, Irish soda bread next to Swedish meatballs, everything contributed by families proud to share their heritage. "This is wonderful," Evelyn said, sampling a dumpling that Mrs. Chen had made. "In Boston, everything was so segregated. You'd never see this kind of mixing." "Well, out here, we can't afford to be too picky about where food comes from," Caleb said. "Survival makes strange bedfellows, or strange potluck companions, anyway." They were interrupted by a commotion near the door, raised voices, then a sudden hush. Evelyn turned to see a group of men entering, led by someone she didn't recognize. He was tall, well-dressed in a way that stood out against the frontier practicality around him, and he carried himself with an arrogance that made her skin prickle. "Who is that?" she asked. Caleb's expression had gone hard. "Warren Blackwood. Owns the Double B Ranch south of here. Big operation, lots of land." "You don't like him," Evelyn observed. "Nobody likes him. But he's got money and influence, so people tolerate him." Caleb's jaw tightened. "He's been trying to buy up smaller ranches, consolidate land. Offered me twice what my place is worth just last month." "But you said no." "Of course I said no. That land's mine. I built it from nothing." He paused, then added quietly, "But he's the kind of man who doesn't take no well." Warren Blackwood scanned the room with the air of someone surveying his domain, and his eyes landed on Evelyn. Something calculating flickered across his face, and he started moving in their direction. "Here we go," Caleb muttered. "Mr. Rhodes," Blackwood said, his voice smooth as oil. "Good to see you, and who is this lovely lady?" "Miss Evelyn Moore," Caleb said, his tone carefully neutral. "The new school teacher. Evelyn, this is Warren Blackwood." "Charmed," Blackwood said, taking her hand before she could offer it and bowing over it with exaggerated courtesy. "A school teacher from back east, if I'm not mistaken. Boston, perhaps?" "Yes," Evelyn said, retrieving her hand as quickly as politeness allowed. Something about him made her want to step closer to Caleb. "How delightful. We so rarely get true culture out here in the wilderness. You must find it all terribly primitive." His tone suggested sympathy, but his eyes held something else. Challenge, maybe, or calculation. "Actually, I find it refreshing," Evelyn said coolly. "There's an honesty here I appreciate." Blackwood's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his gaze. "Refreshing. How diplomatic. Tell me, Miss Moore, are you enjoying your time with our local ranchers? Rhodes here has been showing you around, I understand. The way he said it made it sound vaguely scandalous. Evelyn felt Caleb tense beside her. Mr. Rhodes has been kind enough to help me acclimate to the territory, she said, her voice level but firm. I'm grateful for his friendship. Friendship, Blackwood repeated, as if tasting the word. How nice. Though I wonder if a woman of your obvious breeding and education might find more suitable companionship among those of similar standing. I'd be happy to call on you, Miss Moore. Perhaps show you what a successful ranch looks like. The insult to Caleb was thinly veiled at best. Evelyn felt anger rise hot in her chest, the same anger she'd felt at countless Boston parties where people spoke in polite code about things that mattered. Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby conversations. I appreciate the offer, but I'm quite content with the company I'm keeping. Mr. Rhodes has shown me nothing but respect and genuine kindness, qualities I value far more than the size of one's ranch or the thickness of one's wallet. For a moment, absolute silence fell around them. Blackwood's smile froze, his eyes going cold. Caleb's hand found hers, squeezing gently, whether in support or warning, she couldn't tell. I see, Blackwood said softly. How unfortunate. A woman of quality throwing her lot in with... He gestured vaguely at Caleb. Well, I suppose the frontier changes people, lowers their standards. Or raises them, Evelyn shot back, depending on what you value. Blackwood stared at her for a long moment, and she stared back, refusing to flinch. Finally, he inclined his head with mocking courtesy. Enjoy your evening, Miss Moore. Mr. Rhodes. He turned and walked away, his men following like a retinue. The moment he was gone, the room erupted in whispered conversation. Evelyn realized her hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the adrenaline of confrontation. She'd just made an enemy, probably. But looking at Caleb's expression, pride mixed with concern, she found she didn't regret it. You didn't have to do that, Caleb said quietly. Yes, I did. He insulted you. He insulted what you've built. She squeezed his hand. And I meant what I said, about valuing respect and kindness over money. You're going to cause trouble, Miss Moore, Caleb said, but he was smiling. Good, Evelyn replied. I'm tired of being proper. Let's cause trouble together. The musicians struck up another tune, and this time when they danced, something had shifted. They moved closer, more confidently, as if the confrontation with Blackwood had burned away the last of their hesitation. Caleb's hands were steadier now, and when he looked at her, there was something in his eyes that made her pulse race. They danced until the candles burned low and children fell asleep on their parents' shoulders. They danced until Evelyn's feet ached and Caleb's hands trembled with fatigue rather than nerves. They danced until the music slowed to something soft and sweet, and the remaining couples swayed more than stepped. Evelyn, Caleb murmured, so quietly she almost didn't hear it over the music. This is going to sound crazy. We barely know each other. It's been less than a month, but I have to tell you, don't, she whispered, because she knew what he was going to say, and she was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Not yet. Not here. He understood. She could see it in his eyes. The patience, the willingness to wait, the certainty that whatever this was between them was worth doing right. He nodded slightly and pulled her a fraction closer, the movement so subtle no one watching would have noticed. But Evelyn felt it like an earthquake. When the last song ended and people began gathering their things, preparing for the journey home, Caleb walked Evelyn back to the mercantile. The street was dark, lit only by moonlight and the spill of lamplight from windows. Their footsteps echoed on the wooden boardwalk, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. At the door, Caleb stopped. Evelyn, about what I started to say, I know, she interrupted gently. And I feel it too. But let's not rush. Let's do this properly. Take our time. Even though we've already been gossiped about from here to the mountains? He asked with a slight smile. Especially because of that, let's give them something real to talk about instead of speculation. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the rasp of stubble under her palm. Come see me. Call on me properly. Let me learn all the parts of you that are still mysteries, and let me show you who I really am, not just who I was or who I'm trying to be. Caleb turned his head slightly, pressing his lips to her palm in a kiss that was both chaste and intimate. "You make me want to be better," he said quietly. "Make me forget what loneliness feels like." The words pierced her heart, sweet and sharp at once. She wanted to throw caution away, to tell him she felt the same, that she'd never known it was possible to feel this much this quickly. But wisdom, hard won and dearly bought, held her tongue. "Good night, Caleb," she whispered. "Good night, Evelyn." She went inside, closing the door gently, and stood with her back against it, listening to his footsteps fade away into the night. Through the window, she saw him climb onto his wagon, saw the brief flare of a match as he lit a lantern, saw the wagon roll away toward his ranch 5 miles out. And Evelyn Moore, who had once thought she knew what falling in love felt like, realized she'd been wrong all along. This terrifying, exhilarating rush of emotion that made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously, this was what it meant to truly fall. She just hoped they'd both survive the landing. The weeks that followed, the social fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and impossibly precious. Caleb came to town every Saturday without fail, and Evelyn found herself watching for his wagon with an anticipation that would have embarrassed her if it hadn't felt so right. They walked together, talked together, slowly peeling back the layers of who they'd been and who they were becoming. He told her about Virginia, about the farm his family had owned before the war burned it to the ground, about his mother's gardens and his father's stubborn pride, and the brother who'd died at Antietam. The words came haltingly at first, like water from a rusted pump, but gradually they flowed easier. She learned that he'd enlisted at 17, lied about his age because he'd believed in the cause with the fervor only the young could muster, that he'd learned to shoot hunting rabbits for the table, and had never imagined those skills would translate to killing men. In turn, Evelyn shared pieces of herself she'd kept locked away. The pressure of being Edmund Moore's daughter, expected to marry well and maintain the family's social standing. The relief she'd felt when Thomas had proposed, not because she loved him, but because it meant she'd fulfilled her duty. The slow realization during their engagement that duty wasn't the same as happiness, and the guilty hope that maybe, somehow, it would transform into something real. But it never did, she admitted one Saturday afternoon as they sat by the creek, watching the water run clear and cold toward winter. "I told myself I loved him because I was supposed to, because everyone expected it. But when he left me at that altar, the worst part wasn't losing him. It was the relief I felt underneath the humiliation. Relief that I wouldn't have to spend my life pretending." Caleb was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently tracing patterns in the dirt. "That why you came west? To stop pretending?" "To find out who I am when no one's watching," Evelyn said. "To build something that's mine, not just an extension of my father's name or my husband's status." "Does that sound selfish?" "Sounds brave," Caleb replied. He looked at her with those startling blue eyes, and she saw understanding there. Most people never question what they're supposed to be. They just accept it and die having lived someone else's life. You're building your own. That takes courage. "So are you," Evelyn pointed out. "You could have gone back to Virginia after the war, tried to rebuild what was lost. But you came here instead." "Nothing to go back to. The farm was gone, my parents dead, my brother buried in Maryland. Virginia was full of ghosts." He flexed his hands, watching the tremor that was barely visible in the afternoon light. "Out here, I'm just another veteran trying to make something of himself. The tremor's not unusual. Half the men my age have some kind of war wound. Nobody stares or whispers or treats me like I'm broken." "You're not broken," Evelyn said firmly. "No," Caleb agreed. "But I'm not whole either. There are pieces of me that died in that war, Evelyn. Things I saw, things I did. Sometimes I wake up at night and I can still smell the gunpowder, still hear the screams. Those ghosts followed me west even though the land didn't." Evelyn reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "We all carry ghosts. Maybe the point isn't to outrun them, but to build something strong enough that they can't define us anymore." He turned his hand over, studying their interlaced fingers. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just figuring it out as I go, same as you." She smiled slightly. "Besides, if I were truly wise, I wouldn't be falling for a stubborn rancher who can barely sew a straight line." The words hung into the air between them, more confession than she'd intended. Caleb's eyes widened slightly, and she felt heat creep up her neck. She'd said too much, revealed too much, pushed too fast. But then Caleb smiled, not his usual slight quirk of the lips, but a real smile that transformed his entire face. Good thing I'm falling for a stubborn teacher who thinks crawdad hunting is a valid educational activity. Relief and joy flooded through her in equal measure. It builds character. So does mending shirts in the dark, Caleb replied, and they both laughed, the sound carrying across the prairie like a promise. October gave way to November, and with it came the first real taste of Wyoming winter. The morning Evelyn woke to find frost thick on her window and snow dusting the mountains, Margaret Boone appeared at breakfast with a severe expression and a list of preparations. "Winter here isn't like Boston winters," Margaret said firmly, setting down the list with the weight of Holy Writ. "You'll need warmer clothes, extra blankets, and supplies stored at the schoolhouse in case you get snowed in. Last year, Emily Mitchell, the teacher before the horrible Mr. Peterson, got trapped at the school for 3 days with 6 children. They survived on dried apples and melted snow. I won't have that happening again." Evelyn studied the list: wool stockings, warmer boots, a proper winter coat, emergency food stores, extra firewood, and a dozen other items she'd never have thought of. "This looks expensive." "The school fund will cover the necessities," Margaret assured her. "But you'll need to supplement. Most teachers take on extra work: sewing, tutoring, helping with accounts. The territory provides a salary, but frontier living requires creativity." That afternoon, Evelyn posted a notice at the Mercantile offering tutoring services and fine needlework. Within a week, she had 3 regular students who needed help with reading after school hours, and Mrs. Chen had commissioned her to embroider a set of pillowcases as an anniversary gift for her husband. The work was exhausting on top of teaching, but the extra money meant she could afford the winter supplies without feeling like a burden. Caleb noticed the strain when he came to town that Saturday. She was in the schoolhouse working on lesson plans while snow fell softly outside, and she didn't hear him approach until he knocked on the door frame. "You look exhausted," he said without preamble. Evelyn looked up from her papers, pushing a strand of hair back from her face. "Good morning to you, too." "I'm serious, Evelyn. You've got circles under your eyes, and your hands are shaking worse than mine." He stepped inside, closing the door against the cold. "What's going on?" "Just winter preparations," she said, trying for lightness. "Apparently surviving out here requires more planning than I realized." Caleb took in the stacks of papers, the half-finished embroidery, the ledger where she was clearly tracking every penny. Understanding crossed his face. "You're taking on extra work for supplies." "I'm being practical," Evelyn corrected. "The school fund helps, but I need to pull my own weight. I won't be a charity case." "Nobody thinks you're a charity case." He moved closer, studying her with concern that made her chest tight. "But you can't work yourself to death trying to prove something, Evelyn. The territory's hard enough without adding unnecessary burdens." "They're not unnecessary," she said, frustration creeping into her voice. "I need to show people I belong here, that I can handle whatever frontier life throws at me. Otherwise, they'll just see me as another spoiled East Coast girl who'll run home at the first hardship." "Who cares what they see?" Caleb asked. "The people who matter, the children, the families who trust you with their kids, they already know you belong. The others don't matter." "They matter to me," Evelyn said quietly. "I need to prove I'm more than what Thomas thought I was, more than the woman who wasn't worth keeping his promise to." Caleb's expression softened. He pulled up a chair and sat across from her, taking her hands in his. "Evelyn, listen to me. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Not the town, not your family back east, and certainly not Thomas. You're already more than he could ever see. You're teaching children who've never had a teacher care about them. You're standing up to men like Warren Blackwood. You're building a life on your own terms. That's not proving yourself. That's just being who you are." Tears pricked at Evelyn's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "Then why doesn't it feel like enough?" "Because healing takes time," Caleb said gently. "Trust me, I know. Every time I wake up from a nightmare about the war, every time my hands shake so bad I can't button my own shirt, I feel like I'm not enough. Like I'm still that broken soldier who came west with nothing but trauma and hope. But then I look at my ranch, at the cabin I built with these shaking hands, at the cattle I'm raising, and I remember healing isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. About showing up every day and doing the work, even when it's hard. Evelyn looked at their joined hands, his larger and calloused, hers smaller and ink-stained, two people learning to be whole in their brokenness. When did you figure that out? Still figuring it out, Caleb admitted. But it got easier when I met you. Having someone who sees past the scars to the person underneath, that helps more than you know. She squeezed his hands, feeling the slight tremor there, the physical reminder of battles fought and survived. I see you, Caleb. All of you. And you're more than enough. So are you, he replied. Then, almost shyly, would you come see it? The ranch, I mean. See what I've built, see where I'm trying to make a life. I know it's not proper, you coming out there alone, but I could pick you up after school on Friday, have you back by Saturday morning. Mrs. Boone could chaperone if you wanted, or— Yes, Evelyn interrupted. I'd love to see it. And we don't need a chaperone. We're adults, and I'm tired of letting propriety dictate my choices. Caleb grinned. You're going to scandalize the whole territory. Good, Evelyn said. They could use some scandalizing. That Friday, Evelyn dismissed her students early and waited at the schoolhouse, a small bag packed with overnight necessities. She told Margaret she was visiting the Johnson family, not quite a lie, as she did plan to stop there on her way back, but not the whole truth either. Margaret had looked skeptical but hadn't pressed, which Evelyn chose to interpret as tacit approval. Caleb arrived as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, his wagon freshly cleaned and his horses groomed until they gleamed. He helped her up onto the seat, his hands steady despite the cold, and they set off toward Silver Ridge. The ranch was further than 5 miles, more like 7, Evelyn discovered, along a road that was barely more than wagon ruts through the grass. But as they crested a final rise and the valley spread before them, she understood why Caleb had chosen this place. The land rolled like waves frozen in time, dotted with sage and juniper and the occasional stand of pine. A creek cut through the valley floor, lined with cottonwoods that still held a few stubborn leaves. And there, nestled against a hillside for shelter from the wind, stood Caleb's cabin. It was small, 1 room, maybe 2, built of logs chinked with mud and moss. The roof was sod, already greening with winter grass. A stone chimney rose from one end, smoke curling from it in welcome. Beside the cabin stood a barn, 3/4 finished as he'd said, and a corral where cattle clustered against the evening chill. It's not much, Caleb said, and she heard uncertainty in his voice. But it's mine. It's beautiful, Evelyn said honestly. Caleb, it's beautiful. He looked at her as if trying to gauge her sincerity, then slowly smiled. Come on, let me show you inside before we lose the light. The cabin's interior was spare but surprisingly homey. A bed in one corner, neatly made. A table and 2 chairs he'd clearly built himself, the joints careful if not perfectly smooth. A stove for cooking and heat. Shelves holding supplies, beans, flour, coffee, dried meat, and books. More books than she'd expected, stacked on a makeshift shelf near the bed. You read, she said, moving toward them. When I can't sleep, Caleb admitted. Which is most nights. Shakespeare, Dickens, some poetry. Bought most of them from the mercantile over the years. They help quiet the ghosts. Evelyn ran her fingers over the worn spines, recognizing titles she'd loved in Boston. The idea of Caleb reading by lamplight, seeking solace in words the same way she did, made her heart ache with tenderness. I have a confession, she said, turning to face him. I've been writing to my father. Letters I never send, telling him about my life here, about the teaching, the children, the territory. She paused. About you. Caleb went very still. What do you tell him about me? That you're stubborn and kind. That you treat me like an equal instead of an ornament. That when I'm with you, I feel like the person I was always meant to be instead of the person everyone expected me to become. She took a breath. That I'm falling in love with you, and it terrifies me because I don't know if I can trust my own judgment anymore. The silence stretched between them, heavy, with everything unsaid. Then Caleb crossed the small room in 3 strides and took her face in his trembling hands. I fell in love with you the night you took that needle from my hands, he said, his voice rough. I've been trying to tell you for weeks, but the words never came out right. I'm not good with words, Evelyn. I'm better with actions, so let me show you. He kissed her then, not the chaste pressing of lips to palm, but a real kiss, deep and desperate and full of months of restrained wanting. Evelyn's hands came up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer, and for a moment the world narrowed to just this, his mouth on hers, his hands in her hair, the taste of coffee and promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I know it's fast. I know we should take more time, be more certain, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Evelyn Moore, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face, but for once, they were happy tears. I love you too. God help me. I love you too. They stood there in the gathering darkness, holding each other as if afraid to let go. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling across the valley. But inside Caleb's cabin, wrapped in his arms, Evelyn felt nothing but warmth. They spent the evening talking by lamplight, sharing dreams and fears and all the small details that make up a life. Caleb told her about his plans for the ranch, expanding the herd, finishing the barn, maybe building a larger cabin someday. Evelyn shared her hopes for the school, for children who might otherwise never learn to read or write or imagine lives beyond their immediate circumstances. I want to start a library, she said, curled up in one of Caleb's chairs while he cooked a simple dinner of beans and salt pork. A real lending library where anyone can borrow books. Most of these families can't afford to buy them, but everyone deserves access to stories, to knowledge, to worlds beyond this valley. That's a fine dream, Caleb said, stirring the pot. Where would you put it? The schoolhouse, maybe. Or we could build something separate if we had the funds. She watched him move around the small space with easy familiarity. What about you? What's your dream beyond the ranch? Caleb was quiet for a moment, his back to her. When he spoke, his voice was soft. Honestly, a family. Kids running around, learning to ride, helping with the cattle. A wife who can tolerate my moods and my nightmares. A home that's full of life instead of just me and my ghosts. The image he painted was so clear, so vivid, that Evelyn could almost see it. Children with Caleb's blue eyes and her stubbornness. Mornings full of chatter and laughter. Evenings spent reading by the fire while snow fell outside. It should have terrified her, this vision of domesticity. Instead, it filled her with longing so sharp it hurt. That sounds wonderful, she managed. Caleb turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Does it sound wonderful in the abstract, or wonderful with me? It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. Evelyn stood and crossed to him, taking the wooden spoon from his hand and setting it aside. She looked up into those blue eyes that had seen too much but somehow still held hope. Wonderful with you, she said clearly. Only with you. Relief and joy flooded his face. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and she felt the tremor in his hands had nothing to do with war damage and everything to do with emotion. They ate dinner sitting close together at the small table, knees touching, sharing bites of beans and stories from their day. Caleb told her about a calf that had been born that morning, spindly-legged and stubborn. Evelyn described how little Thomas Johnson had finally managed to write his full name without reversing any letters, the pride on his face worth more than any achievement she'd celebrated in Boston. As the evening deepened into night, they sat by the fire, Evelyn reading aloud from one of Caleb's books while he worked on mending a harness. His hands were steadier now, the tremor barely noticeable as he threaded leather through buckles. She wondered if her presence helped, if love had some healing property medicine couldn't match. Evelyn, Caleb said during a pause in the reading, I need to tell you something about Warren Blackwood. The seriousness in his tone made her set down the book. What about him? He's been making trouble. Subtle things, cattle wandering onto my land that aren't mine, then his men showing up to recover them and taking some of mine in the process. Supplies I order at the mercantile mysteriously not arriving. Small things, but they add up. Because you won't sell to him, Evelyn said, understanding dawning. And because of you, Caleb added reluctantly. Word is he's taken offense to how you turned him down at the social. Blackwood's not used to rejection, especially not public rejection. He sees it as a challenge. Fear prickled down Evelyn's spine. Has he threatened you? Not directly. That's not how men like Blackwood operate. They make things difficult. apply pressure, wait for you to break. Caleb's jaw tightened. But I won't break, and I won't let him hurt you through me. I just wanted you to know what you're walking into if you stay with me. It might get complicated. Evelyn considered this. In Boston, she would have been horrified by the idea of social conflict, of powerful men using their influence to make life difficult. But this was different. This wasn't about social standing or reputation. It was about something real. Land, survival, the life Caleb had built with his own hands. Then we face it together, she said firmly. I didn't come all this way to run from difficult men. I've spent my whole life letting powerful people dictate my choices. I'm done with that. Caleb looked at her with such love it made her chest ache. You're sure? Because once you commit to this, to me, to this life, there's no going back to Boston, to safety, to the easy path. I don't want the easy path, Evelyn replied. I want the real one, the one where I wake up knowing I'm building something that matters, with someone who sees me as a partner, not a possession. If Warren Blackwood wants to make trouble, let him try. We'll weather it the same way we'll weather the winter, together, prepared, and too stubborn to quit. Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. I don't deserve you. Probably not, Evelyn agreed, making him laugh. But you're stuck with me anyway. That night, Evelyn slept in Caleb's bed while he took the floor, both of them acutely aware of propriety despite their earlier declarations. But in the morning, she woke to find him already up, coffee brewing and breakfast cooking, moving around the cabin with the quiet competence of a man long used to caring for himself. You didn't have to sleep on the floor, she said, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders against the chill. Yes, I did, Caleb replied, pouring coffee into tin cups. I love you, Evelyn, and I intend to marry you if you'll have me. But I won't compromise you before I can make that official. You deserve better than territory gossip about ruined reputations. I thought we didn't care about gossip, Evelyn pointed out, accepting the coffee gratefully. We don't care about baseless gossip, Caleb corrected. But there's a difference between people speculating about our relationship and giving them actual ammunition. I want to court you properly, Evelyn. Ask your father's blessing, even if it's after the fact. Do this right. The old-fashioned courtesy of it made her smile. My father will probably be relieved I've found anyone willing to have me after the Thomas disaster. Then he's a fool, Caleb said flatly. Any man would be lucky to call you his. They spent the morning at the ranch, Caleb showing Evelyn around properly in daylight. She met the cattle, stubborn, smelly, and somehow endearing creatures. She saw the work he'd done on the barn, the careful joints and measurements. She walked the property line, where Caleb pointed out landmarks and boundaries, explaining water rights and grazing permits with the patience of a natural teacher. You could teach, Evelyn observed. You explain things clearly, don't assume knowledge, make sure I understand before moving on. Have you thought about it? Caleb looked surprised. Teaching? No, I'm a rancher. You could be both. The territory always needs teachers, especially for older students who need practical skills. You could teach ranching, animal husbandry, land management, things that would help homesteaders succeed. She could see the idea taking root in his mind, possibility blooming. I'll think about it, he said finally. Right now, I've got my hands full, just keeping this place running, but someday, maybe. They started back toward town around noon, Evelyn knowing she needed to make an appearance at the Johnson farm to maintain her cover story. Caleb drove slowly, neither of them eager for the journey to end. When can I see you again? He asked, as Pine Hollow came into view. Tomorrow's Sunday. Church, then dinner at the Andersons. She smiled. You could come to church. Margaret would probably faint from the shock. I might do that, Caleb said thoughtfully. Been a while since I sat in a pew. Wasn't sure God wanted to hear from me after some of the things I've done. God wants to hear from everyone, Evelyn said gently. That's the whole point. Besides, I'd like you there. It would make the sermon about temperance much more bearable if I had someone to exchange meaningful looks with. Caleb laughed. Meaningful looks during a temperance sermon. Very scandalous, Miss Moore. I'm full of scandals, Mr. Rhodes. You should know that by now. They pulled up to the mercantile, and Caleb helped her down with exaggerated propriety that made them both smile. But as Evelyn turned to go inside, he caught her hand. Evelyn, wait. Before we go public with this, with us, I need to know you're sure, really sure. Because once we start courting officially, once I declare my intentions to the whole territory, there's no going back. Your reputation will be tied to mine, for better or worse. And with Blackwood making trouble, it might get worse before it gets better. Evelyn looked at this man who'd become everything to her in a handful of months. This stubborn, kind, damaged, healing soul who saw her as she truly was and loved her anyway. She thought about Thomas, who'd promised forever and delivered humiliation, about Boston, where reputation mattered more than happiness, about all the safe, proper, expected choices she could have made. Then she stood on her toes and kissed Caleb Rhodes right there on Main Street, in full view of anyone who cared to look. When she pulled back, his eyes were wide with shock and delight. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "Now go home before I compromise you further." His laughter followed her all the way into the Mercantile, where Margaret Boone waited with an expression that promised both lecture and congratulations. But Evelyn didn't care. She'd made her choice, claimed her future, and for the first time in her life, she felt utterly, completely free. Margaret was waiting just inside the Mercantile door, arms crossed, expression oscillating between scandalized and triumphant. She'd clearly witnessed the kiss, and from the gleam in her eye, half the town probably had too. "Well," Margaret said, drawing out the word, "I suppose subtlety was never your strong suit, Miss Moore." "No, ma'am," Evelyn replied, unable to suppress her smile. "I find it's overrated." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then her expression softened into something almost maternal. "You love him." It wasn't a question, but Evelyn answered anyway. "I do. More than I thought possible." "Good. He needs someone like you, someone who won't let him disappear into that ranch and his ghosts. And you need someone who sees past the Boston polish to the steel underneath." Margaret paused, then added more quietly, "But you should know, Warren Blackwood was in here earlier, asking questions about you and Caleb. He's not pleased." The warning sent a chill down Evelyn's spine, but she lifted her chin. "Then he'll have to learn to live with disappointment." "That's not his way, dear. Men like Blackwood don't accept defeat gracefully. Be careful." Evelyn promised she would, but as she climbed the stairs to her small room, Margaret's words echoed in her mind. She'd made an enemy of a powerful man, tied her fate to someone that same man wanted to crush. In Boston, such a choice would have been social suicide. Here, it might be literal danger. But as she undressed for bed, her lips still tingling from Caleb's kiss, she found she couldn't regret it. Some things were worth fighting for. Some people were worth the risk. Sunday morning dawned cold and bright, the kind of crystalline winter day that made everything look sharp-edged and new. Evelyn dressed carefully for church, aware that today would mark another turning point. Caleb had said he might come, and if he did, sitting together would be a public declaration that would set tongues wagging from Pine Hollow to the next territory over. She arrived at the church early, greeting families as they filed in. The Johnsons, the Andersons, the Schmidts, all the families whose children she taught, whose homes she'd shared meals in, who'd slowly become her community. They smiled and nodded, and if some of those smiles held knowing speculation, well, that was to be expected. The church filled steadily, the small building warm despite the cold outside from the press of bodies and the pot-bellied stove laboring in the corner. Reverend Matthews took his place at the front, Bible in hand, and Evelyn slid into her usual pew near the middle, leaving space beside her that felt both presumptuous and necessary. The Reverend was about to begin when the door opened one more time. Every head turned, because that's what people did in small towns, and Caleb Rhodes stepped inside, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable but determined. His eyes found Evelyn's across the crowded room. She smiled encouragingly, and something in his posture relaxed. He moved down the aisle with the careful dignity of a man who knew everyone was watching and slid into the pew beside her. "Morning," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. "Good morning," she replied, and their hands found each other beneath the cover of her skirt, fingers interlacing in a grip that felt like a promise. The whispers started immediately, a rustling susurrus that spread through the congregation like wind through wheat. Margaret Boone, sitting 2 rows ahead with her husband, turned and caught Evelyn's eye. She raised one eyebrow, but her expression held approval. Sarah Johnson, across the aisle, smiled warmly at both of them. But Evelyn also caught Warren Blackwood's glare from the back of the church, cold and calculating, and she squeezed Caleb's hand tighter. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat meaningfully, and the congregation settled. The service proceeded normally, hymns sung with more enthusiasm than skill, a sermon about loving thy neighbor that felt pointed given recent tensions, prayers for the community and the coming winter. Through it all, Evelyn and Caleb sat side by side, not touching beyond their clasped hands, but together in a way that needed no further announcement. After the service, as people lingered outside the church in the weak winter sunshine, the conversations flowed around them in waves. Some people approached to offer congratulations, others to probe for details with thinly veiled curiosity. Henry Johnson shook Caleb's hand with genuine warmth. "About time you found someone to settle down with, Rhodes. A good woman makes all the difference." "Don't I know it?" Caleb replied, and the gratitude in his voice made Evelyn's chest tight. They were preparing to leave for Sunday dinner at the Andersons when Warren Blackwood approached with two of his men flanking him. The conversations around them died away, tension crackling in the cold air. "Rhodes," Blackwood said, his tone affable but his eyes hard. "Miss Moore, how nice to see you both looking so cozy." "Blackwood," Caleb replied neutrally. "I wanted to extend my congratulations on your courtship," Blackwood continued, and the word courtship dripped with mockery. "It's touching, really. The struggling rancher and the school teacher, very romantic, very quaint." "We appreciate your interest," Evelyn said, her voice cool, "though I'm sure you have better things to do than concern yourself with our personal affairs." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I always concern myself with what happens in this territory, Miss Moore. It's my responsibility as one of its most successful citizens to ensure everyone's making wise choices." He turned to Caleb. "Speaking of which, Rhodes, I wanted to give you one more chance. My offer still stands. I'll buy your land for fair market value. More than fair, actually. You could take that money, start over somewhere easier, somewhere more suited to your limitations." The word limitations was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut. Caleb's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Evelyn stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwood, I believe Mr. Rhodes has already declined your offer. Repeatedly. Most people would consider continued pressure after multiple refusals to be harassment, not business." Blackwood's attention snapped to her, surprise and anger warring in his expression. "This doesn't concern you, Miss Moore. This is business between men." "It concerns me when someone I care about is being bullied by a man who can't accept the word no," Evelyn shot back. Around them, the remaining congregation had gone silent, watching the confrontation with varying expressions of shock and anticipation. "And I find it interesting that your concern for Mr. Rhodes's limitations only appeared after he refused to sell to you, almost as if you're using his war service as a weapon against him." Blackwood's face darkened. "Be careful, Miss Moore. You're new here. You don't understand how things work." "I understand perfectly," Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite the fear hammering in her chest. "Powerful men try to intimidate those with less power into compliance. It's the same in Boston as it is in Wyoming territory. The difference is, out here, I don't have to smile and pretend I don't see it." For a moment, Blackwood looked like he might actually strike her. His hands clenched into fists, and Caleb moved protectively closer. But then Blackwood seemed to master himself, his expression smoothing into something coldly polite. "You've made your position clear, Miss Moore, as have you, Rhodes. I hope you won't regret your choices when winter gets hard and you need help that isn't forthcoming." He touched his hat in a mockery of courtesy. "Enjoy your dinner." He strode away, his men following, and the moment he was out of earshot, the congregation erupted into whispered conversations. Henry Johnson approached, his expression grave. "That was brave, Miss Moore, but foolish. Blackwood's not a man to cross lightly." "Neither am I," Evelyn replied, though her knees felt weak now that the adrenaline was fading. "I won't stand by while someone threatens the man I love." Sarah Johnson touched her arm gently. "We're with you, both of you. Blackwood's been throwing his weight around for too long. It's time someone stood up to him." Others nodded agreement, the Schmidts, the O'Malleys, even quiet Mayor Boone, who looked uncomfortable but determined. Not everyone, Evelyn noticed. Some families had already drifted away. unwilling to choose sides in what was clearly becoming a conflict, but enough remained that she felt a surge of hope. "Thank you," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "It means a lot." "You're one of us," Henry said simply. "That's what community means." Dinner at the Andersons was a subdued affair, the confrontation casting a shadow over what should have been celebration. But Mrs. Anderson was determined to maintain normalcy, serving roasted chicken and potatoes with determined cheerfulness, while her husband and Caleb discussed ranch business and winter preparations. Katie Anderson cornered Evelyn in the kitchen while they were clearing dishes, her young face serious beyond her years. "Are you really going to marry Mr. Rhodes?" she asked. "He hasn't asked yet," Evelyn said carefully. "But if he does, yes, I am. Even though Mr. Blackwood's angry? Even though it might cause trouble?" Evelyn dried a plate thoughtfully before answering. "Katie, I spent most of my life making choices based on what other people thought I should do. Wearing the right dresses, saying the right things, agreeing to marry a man I didn't love because it was expected. And you know what? It made everyone else happy, but it made me miserable. I won't live like that anymore." Katie absorbed this with the gravity children bring to adult truths. "My mama says Mr. Rhodes is a good man, that he deserves to be happy." "Your mama's right, and so do I. So do you. So does everyone, Katie. Sometimes finding happiness means standing up to people who want you to be small and quiet and convenient." "Is that why you became a teacher?" Katie asked. "To help people be less convenient?" Evelyn laughed, surprised and delighted by the girl's insight. "In a way, yes. Education gives people choices. Knowledge is power. The more you know, the harder it is for anyone to control you." Katie nodded slowly. "Then I'm going to learn everything, so nobody can ever make me do things I don't want to do." "That's the spirit," Evelyn said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The week that followed the church confrontation was tense. Evelyn threw herself into teaching with renewed energy, as if she could ward off coming trouble through the sheer force of education. Her students sensed the tension but responded with surprising maturity, working harder, asking more questions, staying after to help clean the schoolhouse or prepare materials for the next day. Caleb came to town more frequently than his usual Saturday visits, often appearing at the schoolhouse with thin excuses about supplies or messages from families. They both knew the real reason. He wanted to make sure she was safe, that Blackwood hadn't made good on any implied threats. And Evelyn, despite her fierce independence, found she didn't mind his protectiveness. There was a difference between being protected because someone thought you were weak and being protected because someone loved you and worried. They talked constantly during these visits, planning their future with a mixture of pragmatism and hope. Caleb wanted to court her properly through the winter, then marry in the spring when the weather improved. Evelyn agreed in principle, but chafed at the timeline. "That's nearly 6 months away," she protested one afternoon as they walked toward the creek, their usual refuge. "Why wait so long?" "Because I want to do this right," Caleb said. "I want to finish the barn, build an addition to the cabin so we have proper space. I want to save enough money that you're not marrying into pure struggle. And," he paused, vulnerability flickering across his face, "I want to write to your father. Ask his blessing, even if it's after we're already engaged. You deserve that courtesy." "My father will give his blessing," Evelyn said with certainty. "He'll probably be relieved someone's willing to take me on after the Thomas disaster. But Caleb, I don't need a bigger cabin or more money. I just need you." "I need to do this," Caleb insisted. "Not for you, for me. I need to know I'm offering you something solid, something worth having." "Let me build that, Evelyn. Let me be the man you deserve." She understood then that this wasn't about her at all. It was about Caleb's own sense of worth, his need to prove to himself that he was more than a damaged veteran with shaking hands and nightmares, that he could provide, build, create something lasting. "All right," she said softly, "but promise me something. Anything. Promise me that no matter what happens with Blackwood, no matter what trouble comes, you won't face it alone. That you'll let me stand beside you, fight beside you. Partnership means sharing the burdens, not just the joys." Caleb pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I promise, though I reserve the right to occasionally be stupidly protective. And I reserve the right to ignore you when you are," Evelyn replied, making him laugh. The first real test of that promise came in late November, when Caleb arrived at the schoolhouse in the middle of a school day, his expression grim. Evelyn excused herself, leaving her older students in charge, and met him outside. "What's wrong?" "Half my cattle are missing," Caleb said without preamble. "I checked the fences this morning. They have been cut in 3 places. Someone drove them off during the night." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "Blackwood?" "Probably. Can't prove it, but who else would do it?" Caleb's hands were shaking badly. Whether from anger or stress, Evelyn couldn't tell. "Those cattle represent a year's work, Evelyn. Money I was counting on to get through winter, to build the addition. Without them, I'm barely scraping by." "Then we'll find them," Evelyn said firmly. "Has anyone else lost cattle?" "Henry Johnson lost a few head last week, thought they just wandered off, but now I'm not so sure." "Then we gather everyone who's been affected and we go to the sheriff. This isn't just harassment anymore. It's theft." "The sheriff's in Blackwood's pocket," Caleb said bitterly. "Everyone knows it. Filing a complaint won't do anything but make things worse." Evelyn thought fast, her mind racing through options. In Boston, power was wielded through social pressure and reputation. Out here, the mechanisms were different, but the principle remained the same: hit powerful men where it hurt them most. "Then we don't go to the sheriff," she said slowly. "We go to his customers. Blackwood sells beef to the railroads, to the army, to anyone who'll buy. What if word spread that he's a cattle thief, that his herds are built on stolen livestock? The army won't do business with a known thief, and the railroads won't want the scandal." Caleb stared at her. "You want to start a rumor campaign?" "I want to fight fire with fire. Blackwood's been using his influence to make your life difficult. Let's make his reputation toxic enough that his influence stops mattering." A slow smile spread across Caleb's face. "You're devious, Evelyn Moore." "I'm practical. And I'm done playing by rules that only benefit bullies." She squeezed his hand. "But first we need proof. Real proof. Not just suspicions. Can you track the cattle?" "Maybe. Trail's probably cold by now, but I can try." "Then try. And I'll talk to the other families, see who else has lost stock. We'll build a case that's so solid even a corrupt sheriff can't ignore it." Over the next week, Evelyn became an unlikely detective. She visited families under the guise of discussing their children's education, but always steered conversations toward ranch business, losses, suspicious activity. The pattern that emerged was damning. 8 different homesteaders and small ranchers had lost cattle over the past 3 months, always at night, always with cut fences or open gates. And in several cases, those same cattle had later been spotted in Blackwood's herds, brands freshly altered. Meanwhile, Caleb tracked his missing cattle with the skill of a man who'd learned to hunt more than just game during the war. The trail led, as expected, directly to Blackwood's range. But more importantly, it led to a box canyon where Caleb found not just his cattle, but animals belonging to 4 other ranchers, all waiting to be rebranded. He came to Evelyn with the news late one evening, excitement and fury warring in his expression. "I've got him. I've got proof he's been stealing and rebranding cattle. If we can get the sheriff out there before he moves them—" "We're not going to the sheriff," Evelyn interrupted. "We're going to the newspaper." "Pine Hollow doesn't have a newspaper." "No, but Cheyenne does. And the territorial governor's there too." She pulled out a letter she'd been drafting, filled with dates, names, and detailed accounts of theft. "We send this to the Cheyenne Daily Leader, and we send a copy to the governor's office. Make it public enough that Blackwood can't bury it. Make it a scandal that has to be addressed." Caleb read her letter, his expression transforming from skepticism to admiration. "This is detailed. Professional. How did you—" "Boston society operates on scandal and innuendo. I learned how to craft a damaging story before I learned algebra." She smiled grimly. "The difference is, this time the story happens to be true." They sent the letters the next day, paying extra for fast courier service. Then came the waiting, tense, anxious days where every shadow seemed threatening and every stranger potentially dangerous. Caleb stayed close to town, unwilling to leave Evelyn unprotected. The community rallied around them, families taking turns watching both the schoolhouse and Caleb's ranch, creating an informal network of support that spoke to frontier solidarity. Warren Blackwood, sensing something was wrong, increased his pressure. Supplies ordered at the mercantile were again delayed. Fence posts on Caleb's property were knocked over in the night. And one evening, Evelyn found a note slipped under the schoolhouse door. Leave or be left. The threat was unsigned, but its origin was clear. Evelyn showed it to Caleb, who went pale with fury. That's it! I'm not letting you stay in town alone. You're coming out to the ranch where I can protect you. I'm not running, Evelyn said firmly, and I'm not letting him dictate where I live. That's exactly what he wants. To isolate us, make us frightened, break us apart. Then I'm staying in town. I'll sleep in the livery stable if I have to. You'll do no such thing. Your cattle need tending, and we're not letting him destroy everything you've built out of fear. They argued about it for an hour before reaching a compromise. Caleb would stay at the ranch during the day, but come to town each evening, sleeping on the floor of the schoolhouse where he could keep watch. It wasn't ideal, and it certainly fed the gossip mill, but it was practical. And by that point, neither of them cared much what people thought. The response to their letters came faster than expected. The Cheyenne Daily Leader sent a reporter within a week, a sharp-eyed woman named Louisa Chen, who asked pointed questions and took copious notes. She interviewed Caleb, Evelyn, and half a dozen other ranchers who'd lost cattle. She examined the box canyon, photographed the altered brands, and documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what kind of story she had. The article ran on the front page of the territorial edition. Cattle baron or cattle thief? Questions surround prominent Wyoming rancher. It was devastating, detailing the pattern of theft, the suspicious brand alterations, the intimidation of smaller ranchers. It mentioned Blackwood by name and included statements from affected families. The territorial governor's response came 2 days after publication, a telegram to the Pine Hollow Sheriff's Office demanding a full investigation. The sheriff, suddenly finding his spine under threat of territorial oversight, arrested Blackwood's 3 foremen and began recovering stolen cattle. Blackwood himself wasn't arrested. He had layers of plausible deniability, claiming his foremen had acted without his knowledge. But the damage to his reputation was catastrophic. The Army canceled their beef contract. Railroad buyers found other suppliers. And most importantly, his influence in Pine Hollow evaporated like morning frost. The tide had turned, and everyone knew it. Winter arrived in earnest in early December, bringing snow that transformed the prairie into a white wonderland. The schoolhouse required constant heating, and several days the weather was too severe for children from outlying farms to attend. But Evelyn persisted, teaching whoever could make it, making sure each child left with assignments for those who couldn't come. Caleb finished his barn just before Christmas, the achievement he celebrated quietly but proudly. With the immediate crisis with Blackwood resolved and his cattle recovered, he threw himself into preparing for spring, for the wedding he was determined to give Evelyn. He also finally wrote to her father. The letter took him 3 drafts, his shaking hands making the writing nearly illegible at times. But he persisted, explaining who he was, what he offered, and most importantly, how much he loved Evelyn Moore's daughter. He asked for permission to marry Evelyn, acknowledging it was somewhat after the fact given their understanding, but wanting to honor the tradition nonetheless. He showed Evelyn the final draft before sending it. "It's perfect," she said, tears in her eyes. "He'll approve. I know he will." "And if he doesn't?" Caleb asked. "Then we'll marry anyway," Evelyn replied simply. "But he will. He loves me, Caleb, and he wants me to be happy. You make me happy." The response came in late January, delayed by winter storms and the vagaries of frontier mail service. Evelyn Moore's letter was surprisingly warm, acknowledging that his daughter had found her own path and expressing gratitude that she'd found someone worthy of her along the way. He gave his blessing freely, enclosed a bank draft as a wedding gift, and concluded with an invitation for them to visit Boston once they were settled. Evelyn cried reading it, relief and joy and a complicated tangle of emotions about the father she'd fled from and now missed desperately. Caleb held her while she wept, understanding in the way only someone who'd also left family behind could understand. "We'll visit," he promised. "Once spring comes and the ranch is stable, we'll take the train east and you can show me where you came from." "It won't be the same," Evelyn warned. "I'm different now. They'll see that." "Good. Let them see what the frontier made of their proper Boston girl, Someone strong enough to face down cattle thieves and brave enough to love a broken soldier. "You're not broken," Evelyn said for what felt like the 1,000th time. "You're healing. There's a difference." Caleb kissed her forehead. "Then let's heal together." They set the wedding date for late April, when the snow would be melted and the prairie would be greening with spring. Margaret Boone took over the planning with the enthusiasm of a general marshalling troops, organizing everything from flowers to food to music. The entire territory was invited, and it seemed like everyone intended to come, partly to celebrate, partly because frontier entertainment was scarce enough that a wedding was major news. Warren Blackwood left Pine Hollow in early March, his reputation in tatters, his business ventures failing. Word was he'd gone to Montana Territory to start over, and good riddance to him. His departure felt like vindication, proof that standing up to bullies, even powerful ones, was worth the risk. As winter slowly released its grip on the land, Evelyn and Caleb spent their weekends working on the cabin addition. Well, Caleb worked while Evelyn alternated between helping and reading aloud from books they'd chosen for their future library. The addition would serve as both bedroom and sitting room, giving them space to grow, to breathe, to build a life that wasn't cramped or desperate. On one of these weekends, as they took a break from construction to eat lunch by the creek, Caleb pulled out a small box. "I know we're already engaged," he said, suddenly nervous in a way Evelyn had rarely seen. "And I know this isn't exactly a surprise at this point, but I wanted to do it properly, ask the right way." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band, not fancy, but solid and real, the kind of ring that would withstand years of hard use and harder living. "Evelyn Moore," Caleb said, dropping to one knee in the muddy grass. "Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here in this valley, raise children if we're blessed with them, and stand beside me through whatever comes? Will you let me love you for the rest of my days?" Evelyn's vision blurred with tears, but her voice was steady when she answered. "Yes, to all of it. Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit somehow, and stood to kiss her while the creek burbled behind them and the mountains stood witness. It was nothing like the elaborate proposal Thomas had staged in a Boston restaurant, with roses and champagne and an audience of approving society matrons. It was real and muddy and perfect. The week before the wedding passed in a blur of final preparations. Evelyn's students made decorations for the church, Katie Anderson writing "Rhodes plus More" in elaborate script on a banner that would hang above the altar. Margaret coordinated dishes with the efficiency of a diplomat negotiating peace treaties, and Caleb finished the cabin addition, working late into the evenings to ensure everything was ready. On the night before the wedding, tradition dictated they shouldn't see each other. Caleb stayed at his ranch while Evelyn remained in town, surrounded by Margaret, Sarah Johnson, and several other women who seemed determined to keep her calm and distracted. They succeeded mostly, filling the evening with stories and laughter and gentle advice about married life that made Evelyn blush. But as the night grew late and the women finally left her alone, Evelyn stood at her window looking out toward the dark prairie and the mountains beyond. Somewhere out there, Caleb was probably standing at his own window, looking toward town. The thought made her smile. Tomorrow, she would walk down an aisle and promise forever to a man she'd met only 8 months ago. In Boston, that would have been scandalously fast. Here, it felt right. When you found what you were looking for, why wait? She thought of the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach in a thunderstorm, terrified and heartbroken and running from her past. That woman seemed impossibly far away now, not because Evelyn had erased her, but because she'd grown beyond her. The frontier hadn't made her harder, as she'd feared. It had made her truer. And tomorrow, she would become Evelyn Rhodes, wife of a Wyoming rancher, teacher of frontier children, defender of her community, and exactly who she was always meant to be. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and warm, spring asserting itself with wildflowers and birdsong. Margaret arrived at dawn to help Evelyn dress, bringing a gown she'd altered from her own wedding dress, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, practical enough for frontier life, but beautiful in its simplicity. "You look lovely," Margaret said, her eyes bright with tears she'd deny shedding. "Absolutely lovely. Caleb's a lucky man." "I'm the lucky one," Evelyn replied, though her stomach fluttered with nerves. They walked to the church together, arriving to find it already packed with people. The entire territory seemed to have turned out. Ranchers and homesteaders, shopkeepers and farmers, children scrubbed clean and barely containing their excitement. Grace Johnson played piano with surprising skill, filling the small church with music. And at the front, standing beside Reverend Matthews, was Caleb Rhodes. He dressed in his best. The shirt she'd mended that first night, pressed to within an inch of its life. Dark trousers, boots shined until they gleamed. He'd shaved and combed his hair, and when he saw Evelyn at the back of the church, his expression transformed into pure joy. Margaret squeezed her hand once, then released her. This was a journey Evelyn would make alone, just as she'd made the journey west alone. But she wouldn't be alone at the end of it. She walked down the aisle slowly, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers that Katie Anderson had picked that morning. Every step felt momentous, significant. Every face she passed held warmth and approval. This community had become hers, and she had become theirs. Caleb's hands were shaking when she reached him, but his voice was steady as they spoke their vows. Traditional words, ancient promises, spoken in a rough frontier church, but meaning everything. I, Caleb Rhodes, take you, Evelyn Moore, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Evelyn's voice rang clear in response. I, Evelyn Moore, take you, Caleb Rhodes, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do us part. Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, and when Caleb kissed her, the church erupted in applause and cheers. They walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife, partners in everything that mattered, and stepped out into the spring sunshine to face their future. The reception lasted until sunset, filled with food and music and dancing. Caleb proved his dancing had improved with practice, or maybe love just made them move better together. They were toasted and teased, offered advice both sincere and ridiculous, and embraced by a community that had fully claimed them as its own. As evening approached and people began preparing to leave, Henry Johnson pulled Caleb aside for a quiet word. Evelyn saw them talking seriously, saw Caleb's expression shift from surprise to gratitude. When he returned to her, his eyes were bright. Henry says the Territorial School Board is creating a new position, agricultural instructor, teaching practical skills to older students and adults. He's recommending me for it. Part-time, so I can still run the ranch, but steady income and a chance to do something more. That's wonderful, Evelyn exclaimed. You'll be brilliant at it. We'll be brilliant at it, Caleb corrected. Partnership, remember? Your idea, your vision, I'm just the one implementing it. As the last guest departed and the church emptied, Caleb and Evelyn stood in the doorway, looking out at the valley painted gold by the setting sun. Behind them was their wedding, their community, their beginning. Before them stretched prairie and mountains and possibility. Any regrets? Caleb asked softly, echoing the question he'd asked that first night in the station house. Evelyn thought about Boston, about Thomas, about the life she'd been expected to lead. She thought about the woman in the ruined traveling dress, standing in the rain and wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Then she looked at her husband, this man who'd been a stranger 8 months ago and was now her entire world, and smiled. Only that I didn't take that needle from your shaking hands sooner, she said. Only that. Caleb laughed and pulled her close, and they stood there as darkness fell and stars began appearing in the vast Wyoming sky. Two lives that had been separate, then parallel, now finally woven together into something stronger than either had been alone. They climbed into Caleb's wagon, decorated with ribbons by enthusiastic children, and headed toward the ranch, toward home, toward the cabin with its new addition, the land that would feed them, the life they would build together through all the seasons to come. Winter would return, as it always did. There would be hardships and struggles, losses and grief. The frontier gave nothing easily, but they would face it together, the teacher and the rancher, the woman who'd run from shame, and the man who'd run from ghosts, both finding in each other exactly what they'd been searching for. As they rode through the spring night, Evelyn leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. His hands on the reins were as steady as they'd ever been, guided by love rather than haunted by war. "Welcome home, Mrs. Rhodes," Caleb murmured. And it was. Finally, completely, perfectly. It was home. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent, watching as two people who'd been broken by their pasts stitched themselves back together through courage, commitment, and love. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, holding them safe in its vast embrace. And in a small cabin in a Wyoming valley, two lives became one story, a story of healing and hope, of finding light after darkness, of discovering that sometimes the things we're running from lead us exactly where we're meant to be.